So, Mr. Speaker, given that this rule disproportionately impacts people in our black and minority ethnic communities the hardest, will the Home Secretary now suspend the no recourse to public funds rule for the duration of the pandemic?
I thank the Right Honourable Gentleman for his question and his comments. The answer is no. Local authorities have provided a basic safety net, and that is through significant financial provisions introduced by the government and a range of measures to support those people that have been working. And because of coronavirus, because of this national health pandemic, the situation we find ourselves in will support people with no recourse to public funds. And that assistance is being given under the Coronavirus Retention Scheme and also the Self-Employed Income Support Scheme. So these funds are available. And if I may, Mr. Speaker, it is wrong to imply that safety nets are not in place. Local authorities, and I hope he will pay tribute to local authorities, who throughout this pandemic and this crisis have been resourced to an extra £3.2 billion to provide vital financial help.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. On the 26th of March, further to the comments the Home Secretary has just made, MHCLG ministers wrote to all councils asking them to utilise alternative powers and funding to assist those with no recourse to public funds. So it would seem that the government has understood that NRPF is counterproductive during the pandemic in principle, but the lack of clarity from the Home Office on this in practice means that people are still facing destitution. With this in mind, will the Home Secretary look again at the spirit of the Prime Minister's comments to the Liaison Committee and outline how they intend to support those families?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think it's important to place on record that, of course, this isn't just the Home Office. We work across government, and obviously MHCLG, the Department of Local Government and Communities, are central to this. And in terms of the resources that have been provided, practical support such as rent protections and the Coronavirus Job Retention Scheme apply to those under the no recourse to public funds conditions, but also the Honourable Lady mentioned specifically MHCLG and local authorities, £3.2 billion, and I've been working directly with the Secretary of State for MHCLG, and in fact I've also been part of discussions with the devolved administrations as well throughout this whole period, throughout the last 10 weeks, looking at the protective measures and the support that can be provided through the resources provided from central government.
Joanna Cherry.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Black Lives Matter movement and Public Health England's COVID-19 outbreak review of disparities in risks and outcomes have highlighted the inequalities suffered by black and minority ethnic people in our society. Does the Home Secretary accept that the no recourse to public funds policy disproportionately affects people from BAME communities?
Yeah, exactly.
And if she does, why won't she push for it to be suspended as a concrete step towards tackling the inequalities which so appall many of our constituents?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There are a number of points that I'd like to make to the Honourable Lady. First of all, the government published its report last week into the impact of coronavirus on black, Asian, minority ethnic communities. The findings are indeed shocking, and it is right that the government invests its time and resources through the Equalities Minister in particular to look at the measures that can be brought in place. Now, this policy of no recourse to public funds is one of many policies, and it is right as a government that we look at all policies that affect all communities in the round without singling one particular policy out.
Joanna Cherry.
Glad to hear that the Home Secretary is looking at the policy, but I would urge her to read a report that came out this time last year by Agnes Woolley called The Cost of the No Recourse to Public Funds Policy. It found that most families with no recourse to public funds in the United Kingdom have at least one child who is British by birth, and nearly all of those families are black and minority ethnic. Accordingly, no recourse to public funds is inherently more likely to affect BAME British children than white British children. So given this evidence that no recourse to public funds is a policy with racially discriminatory impacts, why won't she accept that it needs to go?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. If I may, I think it's wrong to characterise as a policy of racially discriminatory. It is a fact, however, if I may, it is a fact that for all communities and people of all backgrounds, there are many measures in place in terms of protections financial through the safety net of the welfare state. In addition, Mr. Speaker, when it comes to children, also the funds that are being made available through the Department of Education in terms of pupil premium, there are a plethora of support packages that are combined collectively based upon the individual needs and individual circumstances. And it is right that we treat individuals, people as individuals, and not just categorise them. Now, I think it is important, Mr. Speaker, to recognise that there are a number of issues, there are a plethora of issues that affect people from Black, Asian, ethnic minority communities, but we cannot assume that there is a one-size-fits-all approach or a single policy solution to address those issues. And it is right, as I've already indicated, Mr. Speaker, that my honourable friend, the Minister for Equalities, looks at the report that was published last week, and the government provides a collective response to the many challenges facing the community.
5 withdrawn, so we go straight to Aaron Bell.
Number 2, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank my friend for his question. My department is working extremely closely with the police and the fire and rescue services, as he will be aware, to ensure that they receive all the support that they need, PPE, throughout this COVID-19 outbreak.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Thank the Home Secretary for her answer. Could I also take this opportunity to put on record my support for the police and my sympathies to those who have been injured in the police in the last few days. Also in Staffordshire, I believe the police have done a fantastic job throughout the COVID-19 outbreak. We've got one of the lowest quantities of fines in the country. That's because they've been policing with consent and with the good sense of the people of Newcastle-under-Lyme and the county more widely. But on the PPE point, it's my understanding from them that they are expecting to be reimbursed for the supplies that they have got. They have sufficient supplies. Could the Home Secretary confirm that this will be the case?
Can I thank my honourable friend for his question? And of course, he represents a constituency that I'm familiar with as well. And the work of both his local resilience forum, his police chief constable and police officers and staff throughout the pandemic has been exemplary. It really has. And I want to put on the record my praise for them. With regards to PPE supplies, it is my understanding that the force have obviously achieved sufficient supplies. That is something we've been working with working on a national level. And the government has previously indicated that forces should be reimbursed for expenditure, and obviously we'll be working across government on that.
We now come to the next question from Bim Afolobi.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Question number 3.
Minister Malthouse.
Mr. Speaker, stealing someone's tools is a particularly rotten kind of crime. Not only does it deprive them of their belongings, which is bad enough, but it also often deprives them of their livelihood, notwithstanding the inconvenience it causes to them and to their employers. We're determined to do something about this, which is why I recently convened a group of people from the industry and policing to look at what more we can do to help, and we're spending £25 million on our Safer Streets Fund to drive down exactly this kind of acquisitive crime.
Ben Afolobi.
I thank the Minister for his response. Would he join me in championing the use of modern technology to combat tool theft, like the Tool Watch app designed by Harpenden residents Denise and Alan Brett? This technology makes each tool traceable and can help police fight this crime. Would he take this opportunity to champion Tool Watch and help spread its usage throughout the police forces throughout the country?
Well, Mr. Speaker, the Honourable Gentleman is one of the most original thinkers in the House, and therefore it's no surprise that he champions innovation in all things, including crime fighting. So yes, he's absolutely right. There's lots more we can do harnessing technology to fight crime, and I'd be very interested when we get back to normal to go and visit his constituents and see Tool Watch for myself, so that we can take it and promote it to the industry more generally.
Sir John Hayes.
Question 4, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my right honourable friend for that question. He, of course, has very long experience of matters such as this in the Home Office and elsewhere. On the 1st of January, for the first time in decades, the United Kingdom will have full democratic control over our immigration system, giving us power to determine who comes here and for how long. We do not intend to impose a cap, but our points-based system will make sure that only those with the skills our country needs come to the United Kingdom, and it is our expectation that total migration as a consequence will reduce.
John Hayes.
Mr. Speaker, with the post-COVID economy facing unprecedented challenges and the prospect of job losses, In the same spirit that the Home Secretary showed in condemning this weekend's wicked violence, will the Minister look again at the resident labour market test, which means jobs have to be offered here before they can be filled from abroad? Rebuilding Britain means backing British workers, Mr. Speaker.
Well, my right honourable friend is of course correct that we want to encourage as many people as we possibly can from the UK to take up job opportunities that are available. Our objective ultimately is to see a full rate of employment. We've laid out the points-based test that will apply from the 1st of January of next year, making sure that only people with high skills can come here. But of course, it is up to this House and this Parliament to keep that under review on an ongoing basis to make sure we are striking the right balance in the way that he's describing.
I'm grateful for all the Home Secretary is doing to bring in this new policy, which I hope brings higher wages and higher skills. But doesn't it also require tougher enforcement against the dreadful people traffickers who are making money out of making a mockery of our laws and undermining all that we stand for?
Well, my right honourable friend is absolutely correct. People trafficking and people smuggling is a shocking offence that causes untold human misery. Last year, immigration enforcement made, I think, 259 arrests in connection with people smuggling and secured 101 criminal convictions. But I would like to assure my right honourable friend this is an area where we can, must and will go a great deal further.
Caroline Nancy.
Question 10. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Home Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, domestic abuse is a horrific crime that shatters the lives of those affected. We are working closely with domestic abuse organisations, the Domestic Abuse Commissioner and the police to ensure that the help and support continues to be available, and more so while the COVID-19 restrictions apply as they currently do.
Ansel.
Mr. Speaker, and thank you, my right honourable friend, for her commitment to work in this area. 1 in 4 perpetrators are repeat offenders, as many as 6 different victims for others. In that light, does my right honourable friend agree with me that greater uptake of DRIVE, an intensive intervention programme aimed at perpetrators, could save lives, change the narrative and break the generational cycle which sees children raised in homes where they've witnessed abuse go on in later life to be at greater risk themselves of becoming either abuser or victim?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I wholeheartedly agree with my honourable friend, and she has highlighted many of the challenges but also issues, but also the opportunities in terms of how we can work with partner organisations to provide the right kind of support that is needed to tackle the root causes of domestic abuse, and also to protect children but also educate them in terms of their own safeguarding. There are many opportunities through which this government is doing that right now so that we can ensure we tackle this heinous crime. The landmark Domestic Abuse Bill, which began its committee stage on the 4th of June, is a significant opportunity to put this in law to transform our response to domestic abuse, but importantly provide the support, the crucial and critical support to victims and bring the perpetrators to justice.
11 and 12 withdrawn. We now come to Shadow Home Secretary Nick Thomas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I know that following this session there will be a statement on the events of the weekend, so I will address those matters then. On domestic abuse, which is the subject of this question, I would like to welcome the fact that the government responded to the calls of those on these benches and campaigning charities on the need for a funding package for the sector. Labour called for £75 million for domestic abuse services specifically, with specialist services such as those for migrant women protected. Can the Home Secretary confirm how much of this investment has reached the front line?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Right Honourable Gentleman will be well aware of the funding packages that the Home Office, along with MHCLG and the MOJ, put towards the Treasury recently. But what I can say, Mr. Speaker, in terms of the money that has reached the frontline support organisations who are running key services and vital services, including helplines, chat functions and improving their own technological capabilities, so far £1.2 million has been allocated to date to 13 organisations specifically for this COVID-19 response to help expand helplines, online capability and of course provide the additional support guidance so that victims can continue to access the support that they need.
Nick Thomas.
Well, £1.2 million of support for helplines is obviously very welcome, but it's a tiny proportion of the overall £75 million, and that really does need to reach where it is needed as soon as possible. As of 2019, 1 in 6 refuges had closed since 2010, and local authority spending as a consequence of austerity had fallen from £31.2 million to £23.9 million in 2017. Resulting in 60% of women being turned away from refuges for lack of spaces. Now that simply isn't good enough. Can the Home Secretary, even if she doesn't know the specific figure today, go away and confirm that she will do all that she can to ensure that the money that's been announced actually reaches the front line? Yes, we do have the domestic abuse bill coming through Parliament, but we cannot legislate our way out of this alone. That money is needed now.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Honourable Gentleman is absolutely right about the money that is required to go to frontline services, which is why, and he did ask of the £76 million, the amount of funding that has been allocated to domestic abuse. As I've indicated, it's split across 3 departments. The Ministry of Justice has itself received £15 million for the work with local domestic abuse charities through the criminal justice system. But his specific question was about the need for refuges, refuge provision, and obviously the Department for Local Government and Communities will be allocating £10 million to domestic abuse safe accommodation services. It is important that we all recognise that is where the demand is. Throughout this very difficult period, Mr. Speaker, where refugees have found it difficult to operate, there have been a widespread of measures that we as government, in our engagement with them, directly with the Commissioner as well for domestic abuse and the Victims Commissioner, have deliberately sought to find practical means and support for the front line, specifically to support them throughout this emergency.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Just building on my right honourable friend's answer to the question on refuges, something that COVID-19 has also highlighted is, despite the best efforts of the staff in our refuges across the country, including in the North West, many of those who've sought refuge there, including their children, in some circumstances, haven't had access always to a good internet connection, often a lifeline to them, and particularly for children who need education. As we start to roll out the broadband across the country to fulfil our manifesto commitment, will my right honourable friend commit to looking at refugees as one of those who should be at the front of the queue to make sure that this is something that people know will be there should they seek that sanctuary?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My right honourable friend makes a vital and very important point. I've seen for myself, actually, working with Refuge and other third-party organisations in the domestic abuse space, the amazing work that they do in terms of internet safety within refuges. And I think we must always put first and foremost the safety of the victims within the environments that they are living. But he's right to highlight that without the internet, too many, including children, are cut off, and obviously that has a hindrance to them in terms of their own development and their own well-being. I will absolutely take a suggestion away with me and ensure that as we build greater internet safety provisions in refuges for domestic abuse victims, we also think about what more can we do to give them the right kind of safeguards, but the right provision.
Dr. Julian Lewis.
Number 16, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, I'm very glad my honourable friend has raised this question. We should be... Oh, but I beg your pardon. Could I, with your permission, Mr. Speaker, group this with questions number 17 and 18? Very kind, Mr. Speaker. I do apologise for overlooking that. So I'm very glad this question has arisen. We should be absolutely clear that these crossings of the English Channel are extremely dangerous. They're crossing the busiest shipping lines in the world. They are facilitated by criminal gangs who are ruthlessly exploiting vulnerable people. And the crossings are entirely unnecessary because France is a safe country and France has a very well established and functioning asylum system. We are therefore working around the clock with our French counterparts to stop these illegally facilitated crossings, sharing intelligence between the NCA here and the French authorities, and working with the French to prevent on the beach embarkations taking place on an around the clock basis.
Dr. Julian Lewis.
Well, that's a very clear answer as far as it goes, but it does appear to be the case that French patrol boats are escorting these dangerously overloaded inflatables across the channel until they reach English waters, whereupon, or I should say UK waters, whereupon our patrol boats pick up the occupants and ferry them to our shores. Now, I understand that this is because we have to save people who've put themselves and sometimes their families at serious risk at sea. But how can we remove perverse incentives to behave in such a dangerous fashion?
Well, it's worth emphasising that where boats get into difficulties in French waters, for example, if their engine breaks down, then the French will pick them up and take them back to France. We must, of course, as the Honourable Gentleman says, be very mindful of safety at life, but we are, at the moment, reviewing our operational practices in these areas for the reasons he mentions. But let me say that half of the attempted crossings are intercepted by the French on the beach. We have so far, since last January, returned 155 people who have crossed, and we seek to return many more.
Sally Ann Hart.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Migration policy is a core aspect of our national sovereignty. Could my right honourable friend please confirm that the UK will have a fair immigration policy which welcomes people who come to the UK legally, irrespective of nationality or religion, and that we take back control over illegal immigration?
Well, I entirely agree with the point my honourable friend makes, and indeed the similar points made by the member for Dover on this topic. We have a points-based system coming into force shortly. We granted asylum or protection to 20,000 people last year, one of the highest figures in Europe, and we welcomed 3,000 unaccompanied asylum-seeking children, the highest number of any country in Europe. Our legal migration methods are entirely fair. We therefore should be policing with complete effectiveness illegal migration routes, and the Home Secretary and I are determined to do that.
Charles Watley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank my right honourable friend for his earlier answer. But we know that the migrants, as they cross the Channel, are sometimes threatening the French Navy that they will throw themselves or their children into the sea. This is an appalling act, and we need to get the French Navy to step up to the plate and actually take these people off the boats in international waters. What are we doing now to make sure this happens?
Well, discussions are underway between the UK government and the French government. Indeed, I'm speaking to my opposite number, the French Deputy Interior Minister, Monsieur Nunez, on Thursday of this week. But there is more we're doing as well, including working with the French OCRIES, the French gendarmes, the PAF, the Police aux Frontières, to make sure that as many of these embarkations are stopped before they even get onto the water. About 50% are stopped already before they even get onto the water. We would like that number to be a great deal higher.
We now come to Olivia Blake.
Question 19, Mr. Speaker.
Home Secretary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, with your permission, I would like to group this question with 20. The Home Office is committed to rooting out hate crime across our society, and we are in continued conversations and discussions with the police and partners across government to ensure that these criminals face justice. The government has a zero-tolerant approach to the vicious misinformation that seeks to blame any race or religion for the spread of all sorts of coronavirus rumours and misinformation, deliberately spreading false information in order to undermine our respect and tolerance for each other has been disgraceful, and obviously we are working across government to stamp this out.
Olivia Blake.
Last month in South Yorkshire, there was a tripling in hate crime, and even more shockingly, a doubling in the amount directed at East or South Asian descent. Muslim communities have also been attacked and singled out over Ramadan and Eid. What engagement has she had, Mr. Speaker, with those communities at risk?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd say to the Honourable Lady, first of all, the figures that she has quoted are simply shocking, disgraceful and unacceptable. And it speaks to individuals, a small minority, and their lack of tolerance and respect for the communities that she refers to. She has specifically asked me the engagement that I have had, but of course across government we are engaging in the Home Office as well, with different groups, different leaders of organisations, at a ministerial level, but also at an individual level as well. And what I would say to the Honourable Lady and to all colleagues here, we absolutely condemn the appalling racial discrimination, hateful way in which misinformation has been spread, but also the way in which this has been targeted against specific communities.
Question 20, Mr. Speaker. Oh, just question, okay. As we're all aware, there has been a disproportionate number of deaths of black people as a result of the coronavirus, with a number of equality organisations raising concerns about closed online groups mobilising to incite hatred and violence against communities who are becoming COVID-19 scapegoats. Stop Hate UK claim the real number of hate crimes is likely to be much higher, as incidents against people and places of worship are significantly underreported. And can the Minister confirm what specific plans have been put in place to proactively address the feared increase in hate crime?
I thank the Honourable Lady for her very, very important question and the points that she has made. Any form of hate crime is, of course, completely unacceptable, and we expect the perpetrators of such crimes to be brought to justice. And I would suggest and ask anybody who is a victim to ensure that they do engage with the police and have crimes reported. In terms of the government's response and working across government, obviously the Home Office and MHCLG continue to work carefully with the National Police Chief Council, importantly to ensure that all police forces are providing the assistance, and we police by consent in this country, but providing the assistance to communities, community organisations, having the right kind of dialogue and support, but also encouraging that hate crime throughout this pandemic, there are no excuses, are reported. And I myself and across police and across government, we continue to work with civil society partners. That is absolutely the right thing to do, and we'll continue to do so.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As the Secretary of State has mentioned, there has been a sharp increase in online hate crime during the coronavirus lockdown. Organisations providing advice and support for victims are predicting a big surge in hate crime following the relaxation of lockdown measures. So can the Secretary of State tell me what steps the government is taking to introduce counter-messaging for religious, ethnic and LGBT+ groups who fear an escalation in hate attacks, and what additional funding will be given to those organisations responding to increased demand for advice and support?
No, I thank the Honourable Gentleman for his question, and he's right to ask about the cross-government work that we do and support for organisations, both within the Home Office but with MHCLG as well. It's clear particularly we see a lot of this activity take place online. We are absolutely making sure that we can tackle that. We do have robust legislation in place to deal with cyber attacks, internet trolls, harassments and perpetrators of grossly offensive and menacing obscene behaviour. We will continue to do that. But of course through other means, places of worship and other activities across government, and we will absolutely continue to make sure that they are resourced in the right way, but importantly that we continue that community engagement and dialogue.
Catherine West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Question 22.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, I've been making an assessment of this matter in recent weeks, and following publication of the most recent ONS data, I can announce to the House today that with effect from the 15th of June, the asylum support rate will be increased from £37.75 a week by 5% up to £39.60 a week. That is about 5 times higher than the prevailing rate of inflation, which is currently 0.8%.
From West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's rather an ungenerous increase, I have to say, given that it can be as low as £37 a day for certain people seeking asylum. However, any increase is something which I welcome. And could he tell me whether he could live on under £40 a day?
Well, it's per week. The rate is £39.60 per week. And it's calculated by methodology which is approved by the courts, and it is done with reference to ONS data based on the incomes of people in the bottom 10% of the population. So it's done with reference to figures by a court-approved method, and that is the right way to fix this thing. And I say again, a 5% increase is very substantially higher than inflation.
Butler. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Question number 23.
Mr. Speaker, by your grace, I'd like to group this question with question 24, please. The government is, of course, committed to delivering an extra 20,000 police officers over the next 3 years and putting violent criminals behind bars for longer. That is why we are giving the police literally wheelbarrows full of cash, £700 million this year to help with the recruitment of 6,000 additional officers by the end of March 2021. 3,005 of these extra officers have already been recruited.
Butler. I thank the Minister for his answer. May I first congratulate and ask him to join me in so doing all of Aylesbury's police for ensuring that the Black Lives Matter march in the town on Saturday passed off peacefully, thanks also due to the cooperation of the organisers and the community partners. Having recently been on a socially distanced patrol with the police superintendent in Aylesbury, I know the increase in officer numbers and the cash that he referred to will be very much appreciated. Can my honourable friend assure me that the process of additional recruitment will be sustained despite the undoubted pressures on the public purse due to coronavirus?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I share the honourable gentleman's congratulations to his police force for the peaceful passing off of the protests in his area on Saturday. And can I thank him for, in his first few months as a member in this House, taking the trouble to spend some time with his local police. It's always informative, and I would urge all members to do the same. Of all the promises that were made at the general election, I know that delivering Brexit and delivering 20,000 police officers are the two closest to the Prime Minister's heart, and with confidence I can therefore say we will complete that task in the time allotted.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to take the opportunity to place on record my thanks to Joe Farrell, the Chief Constable of Durham and Darlington Police Force, for the calm and controlled way that her force, and in particular her excellent weekly virtual briefings that she's done across party to make sure that the MPs and council leaders are up to speed. In recent calls, one point of concern has been the frustrations that arise from the delays in restarting court proceedings. Can I ask the Minister to further encourage the Minister of Justice to do everything possible to find a safe way to get as much progress as possible on reopening the courts so that all of our police forces result in criminals being dealt with?
Mr. Speaker, can I join the honourable gentleman in offering my congratulations to his local police force and Chief Constable for the work they've done throughout the lockdown. The police force across the entire country has done a fantastic job and remained remarkably resilient throughout the last few difficult weeks. He is quite right that the impact of the crisis on the courts has been profound and has resulted in the workload, the caseload, if you like, rising quite significantly. Double-hatted as I am between the Home Office and the MOJ gives me a ringside seat at creating the recovery plan for the courts, and on Friday I held a meeting between the Court Service, the Lord Chancellor and Chief Constables from across the country to start to outline to them what the recovery plan was, and I'm confident that it will be put in place quite soon.
Minister Surridge.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As the Shadow Home Secretary said earlier, the issues around the horrific killing of George Floyd and the protests at the weekend will be dealt with in a statement later this afternoon. I'd like to ask the Minister about his wheelbarrows full of cash. We wrote, Mr. Speaker, to the Home Secretary, along with many police and crime commissioners in early May, in response to a letter from the policing minister to a PCC suggesting that funding for recruitment of the first tranche of the 20,000 additional police officers promised by the Prime Minister be repurposed to fund COVID-19 pressures. So can the Minister confirm today categorically that that letter was incorrect and that funding for recruitment of those desperately needed additional staff will not be diverted and that the wheelbarrows full of cash will continue to recruit those 20,000 police as promised?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm grateful to the honourable lady for allowing me to clear up what is obviously a misunderstanding. I held throughout the crisis, I've held weekly calls with police and crime commissioners from across the country to talk to them about the issues that they're facing. One of the issues that was brought to us relatively early was the issue of cash flow. Obviously, a number of forces have faced additional costs during the crisis and felt that their cash flow, not the absolute cost, but their cash flow might come under pressure. We therefore agreed to a number of measures, not least advancement of the pension grant and indeed the early delivery of half of the ring fence on recruitment to ease that cash flow. That is a separate issue from the overall cost, and our discussions with the Treasury about that cost and with police and crime commissioners are ongoing.
Rachel Maskell.
26, please.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As we battle coronavirus, I'm in constant contact with law enforcement leads alongside with the policing minister. And we have listened to their needs from the start and empowered our outstanding police officers and forces to reduce the spread of coronavirus and save lives. And of course, central to that, Mr. Speaker, are the social distancing measures, and the police continue to work constructively across all our communities to engage, explain, encourage, and of course enforcement is the last resort.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There is so much confusion now about social distancing, despite just guidance given, whereas in Wales, legislation was made to give police the powers they need to put this in place. So what discussions has the Home Secretary had with Cabinet colleagues to introduce similar legislation now, particularly as we're seeing lockdown lifted and more danger being presented into our communities?
Well, Mr. Speaker, what I would say to the Honourable Lady is, first of all, when it comes to social distancing measures, the government could not have been clearer that we all need to, in order to stop the spread of the virus and control the virus. We do, and from a policing perspective as well, the regulations are very clear in terms of ensuring that we work constructively with our communities to social distance, but also, as I've said, enforcement is the last resort, and the police have the power to issue fines of up to £100 in the first instance. And she will be interested to know that since the 29th of May, 15,000 FPNs have been issued since the 27th of March and the 25th of May. And in Wales, she mentioned 1,300 FPNs have been issued, taking the total for England and Wales to just under 17,000.
Number 27, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As set out in my statement last week in the Commons, the public health measures at the border that are being introduced from today are the latest cross-government measures in our collective response and fight to save lives, protect the British people, and importantly, prevent a second wave of coronavirus. Alongside the Minister for the Cabinet Office, the Secretary of State for Transport, Business and Health, I've worked across government and the devolved administrations with science and industry to carefully, from a cross-government perspective, develop this health policy.
I thank the Home Secretary for her answer, but the reality is that some of the government's response is likely to increase the risk of a second wave, and also it is not clear why the government is not agreeing to a 48-hour fast-track system of quarantining instead of 14 days, which will do damage to our businesses. What steps will she take to ensure that it can be done within 48 hours?
Hear, hear. Well, Mr. Speaker, first of all, the policy is clear and it has been outlined not just by myself but other colleagues across government. This is a cross-government policy, and she will be aware that the regulations are public health regulations, and in addition to that, the specific measures that clearly have an impact upon the transport sector are being led by the Department of Transport but also other government departments. From a health perspective, because this is all about health, these are public health measures at the border. We are guided not just by the science, but also working with the Department of Health and sage advice and scientific advisors in terms of how this policy has been developed.
Comment again. Okay.
Scientists say the quarantine introduced today has come too late. The police say it's unenforceable. The tourism and aviation industry say it will ruin them. And the Home Secretary's own department has said it is very hard to imagine how it will practically work. In contrast, our proposal for a 48-hour testing-led model would be targeted, efficient and keep the country open for business. So can the Home Secretary explain to the House how her plan is better and why the government thinks it's right and everybody else is wrong?
To the Honourable Gentleman, Mr. Speaker, I'd say the following. First of all, this is not my plan. This is a government plan and government policy. And I think in terms of the approach that has been taken, the government has maintained throughout this pandemic that medical and scientific advice in terms of border measures are consistent and are now being applied. And that is why throughout this entire outbreak, across the whole of government, working with every government department, we have brought in and identified the right measures. But he's right to highlight the impact upon business and the economy, which is why I held a roundtable with the transport sector last week, who raised a number of issues, not just about quarantine, but also about the business costs, issues around business rates, issues around furlough. This is not for one department just to solely address these issues, and it is right that we work across government to look at how we can introduce new measures. And if he will recall from my statement last week and the questions that I answered, I covered potential air bridges, fast testing, immunity passports, how we can digitalise the response at the border. That is a cross-government response, and that is something that all my colleagues across government, led by the Department of Transport and the Department of Health, are currently working on.
Ben Bradshaw.
She claimed again, Mr. Speaker, this policy is backed by the science. The Chief Scientific Officer says it's not. So will she please publish today the advice she received from SAGE that led her to introduce this irrational, jobs and holidays destroying measure?
Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, I refer the honourable gentleman to the comments that I made in the House last week in terms of the scientific advice from the Home Office's own scientific advisor, and of course that advice will be published.
We're now going to topical questions. We come with question 1, Natalie Alford.
Question 1, please, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, the remarkable success of Hong Kong is predicated on its freedom, its autonomy, and upon the remarkable industry of its people. The decision by the Chinese National People's Congress to impose a national security law on Hong Kong is a clear breach of China's international obligation and a threat to the freedom of the people of Hong Kong. If China follows through with this legislation, then Britain will not hesitate to act. We will put in place new arrangements to allow those in Hong Kong who hold British national overseas passports to come to the UK, enabling them to live and apply to study and work for extendable periods of 12 months, leading to a pathway to British citizenship. If it proves necessary, the British government will take this step and take it willingly. We will never abandon our commitment to the freedom of Hong Kong and its people.
Ashley Alford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Newborn babies are put at risk of hypothermia, toddlers stripped of their life jackets and dangled over the side so that to prevent interceptions, pregnant women forced aboard at gunpoint. Does the Home Secretary agree with me that it is humanitarian as well as the right thing to do to tackle and put a stop to these ruthless criminal gangs, to return boats to France, and to give her the legal powers she needs to put a stop to the small boat crossings once and for all?
Well, my honourable friend is absolutely right, Mr. Speaker, and she will know from the discussions that we had even as recently as Friday the extent to which the level of criminality and the exposure and the abuse that is undertaken by people traffickers who are forcing mothers, children onto unseaworthy vessels and the horrendous circumstances that they are put under. My honourable friend, the Immigration Minister, earlier on outlined the approach that this government is taking to tackle the abuses, go after the criminals and the facilitators of this crime. And Mr. Speaker, we will not stop pursuing this policy until we absolutely break the pathway that these criminal gangs are using.
Mr. Speaker, the Home Office says there are 9,000 looked after children and care leavers eligible for EU settled status. To date, 11% of these children have had such status. Why doesn't the Home Office consider a blanket approval for these vulnerable children and spare us all an administrative nightmare and a second Windrush?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd say to the honourable gentleman that when it comes to EU settled status, we are working with local authorities in particular to give them the support that they need. And I hope that particularly in his own constituency and to all honourable and right honourable members across the House, they will continue to work in a constructive manner in this way to ensure that children are granted the settled status that they are due.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does my right honourable friend agree that the right to protest is a fundamental part of our democracy, but that right does not extend to physically assaulting our heroic police officers? And can she confirm that those perpetrators who assaulted police officers and engaged in public disorder over the last few days will feel the full force of the law?
My honourable friend is absolutely correct. We strongly support the right to protest peacefully, but that does not extend to the violent behaviour that we have witnessed across the country throughout the weekend. And, Mr. Speaker, when it comes to any assault on our brave police, that is completely unacceptable. Any perpetrator should be in absolutely no doubt that they will be arrested and prosecuted. Assaults on emergency workers must be handled with the appropriate severity by the entire criminal justice system in a consistent way. And this government will go even further, as we have committed to consult shortly on doubling the minimum sentence for those who assault an emergency worker to ensure that the sentence truly fits the crime.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, the government needs a refresher course in its own policies. The Prime Minister thinks no recourse to public funds He doesn't know what it means, and the Equalities Minister and apparently the Home Secretary think it means lots of help and support is available. In Newcastle today, no recourse to public funds means a mother unable to buy food or nappies for her baby, a British citizen in the middle of a pandemic with no public help available. Does the Home Secretary know that? Does she care?
To the Honourable Lady, she is completely wrong in her categorisation. First of all, public health measures are available right now, in addition to the fact that this is a public health emergency, so it's wrong to assert in the way in which she has done. And also, when it comes to funds, I've outlined the funds, working across government with MHCLG, vital funds, resources that have been provided to local authorities to provide support to people that need that extra support, and that is something that this government is committed to.
We come now, T5 has been withdrawn, so we come to Yvette Cooper.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I know we'll return to the protest issues and the statement shortly. This evening, there will be a television dramatisation of the terrible injustice inflicted on Anthony Bryan by the UK Home Office during the Windrush scandal, and a case that we raised in the Select Committee 2 years ago. Will the Home Secretary agree with the urgency and importance of the government now accepting and acting on all of the recommendations in Wendy Williams' review? And in particular, given the timing of the immigration bill, has she implemented recommendation 7, a review of the hostile environment, including its impact on race equality?
Mr. Speaker, the Right Honourable Lady will be well aware from the statement that I made in the House earlier on this year that when it comes to the Windrush Lessons Learned review, I'm looking at all the recommendations, and I have committed to return to this House to outline those recommendations and also the implementation of them. I think it's really important, Mr. Speaker, for me to say categorically again on the record that review was distressing, and there were many strands in terms of institutional thoughtlessness that were applied to the Home Office. Last week, I think it was Wednesday last week, I met again and had a substantive discussion with the Windrush Advisory Task Force to look at various facets of the review, to discuss the issues around compensation, but also to discuss the measures that do need to continue to be pursued by the Home Office in terms of ways of working. That work is ongoing. That is absolutely ongoing. There are cultural changes that need to be brought to the Home Office as well to understand and to resolve many of the issues that from her own position as chair of the Select Committee she will be familiar with, and her Select Committee covered a few years ago, 2 years ago. And it is important that we give not just the department but also give myself the time to work with Wendy Williams to bring forward those measures so that we can right the wrongs of the past.
We go over to a virtual Dr. Luke Evans. Dr. Luke Evans.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Just a couple of weeks after I gained the nomination to stand as the Member of Parliament of Bosworth, a young man was literally stabbed to death at the end of my road in Hinckley. What is her department doing to rid us of this horrible scourge of knife crime, both before the COVID-19 outbreak and during it?
Secretary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank my honourable friend for his question and for raising what is a distressing and horrendous case. I think, Mr. Speaker, quite frankly, too many young lives have been lost to knife crime. And that is why we are absolutely continuing in our plans and determination to recruit 20,000 police officers. Policing Minister has already outlined the way in which that is working and the funds that have been allocated. But importantly, it is right that we have legislated to take more knives off our streets, and that our serious violence bill will place a new duty on public agencies to reduce serious violence. And of course, Mr. Speaker, that does mean public agencies coming together at a community level to work to stamp out that violence, but also to provide the right kind of support that young people need in the community to avoid a life of crime and violence and to be protected from these horrible, heinous crimes.
We'll be pleased to hear from a virtual Barry Sherman. Barry Sherman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I only wish I could be with you to ask this question to the Home Secretary. She will know that drugs and the running of drugs is at the heart of so much violence when it occurs in our constituencies. And there was some good money that she's responsible for the violence reduction units, which was very welcome because it enabled police forces to have those extra resources. But it's on a yearly basis. And my police commissioner and my police locally tell me that it needs to be known that they're going to have that money for a number of years to be effective. Would you move on that and help my community and communities?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I thank my right honourable friend for his question, but also for highlighting what are just some of the most shocking aspects of serious violence. And he mentions the violence reduction units that play a phenomenal role when it comes to, at a local level, reducing violent crime. But also he has touched on the issue of drugs, and in particular county line drugs as well. And a lot of the work has been combined, and there's more resources now to police forces specifically for reducing serious violence, for violence reduction units, but also for rolling up county lines. And the right honourable gentleman would be absolutely clear, he will be cognizant and aware of the work that's taking place in his constituency with his Chief Constable and his Police and Crime Commissioner to really make sure that all those strands come together to make sure that we can absolutely tackle the scourge of serious violence.
Gullis. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In Stoke-on-Trent North, Kidsgrove and Torque, residents have reported the illegal use of off-road bikes around natural beauty spots like Ford Green Nature Reserve or the football pitches of Kidsgrove lads and dads at Birchamwood Country Park. Will my right honourable friends join me and local councillor Dave Evans in encouraging my local Police and Crime Commissioner Matthew Ellis to work with the Chief Constable to start taking tougher action on the illegal use of vehicles and confiscate them where the law has repeatedly been broken?
My honourable friend is absolutely right, and of course the rule of law applies to everybody, and in particular I commend the work of his local council colleagues. I commend the work in which he himself has led, but particularly to work with the Chief Constable and continue to urge the Police and Crime Commissioner to tackle this scourge, because any crime of this nature blights communities, and it's communities that are disproportionately affected by this.
Tracy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. While many people completely understood the impact of the strict global lockdown on their personal travel plans, things are beginning to change at destinations across the world. Many of our constituents are due to travel in the next few weeks, but now face potential financial loss because of the lack of clarity over whether the quarantine policy is a refundable reason for cancellation under their insurance policy. So can I ask the Home Secretary what discussions has she had with the insurance industry about cancellations due to the impracticality of quarantine for those about to go abroad, and will she commit to giving her speedy support to travel corridors so that our hard-working constituents can go on the holiday that they've saved for?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Honourable Lady will be well aware of the comments that I made last week about travel corridors, specifically international travel corridors, working across government, so with transport, but also with the FCO, because the travel advice right now is still very clear that all advice is against travel, non-essential travel. But it is important, and the Honourable Lady has made a valid point here about insurance companies, refunds, and some of the financial responsibilities and liabilities. We're working across government, as I've said to the House, not just today but last week, to make sure that all these considerations are being actively pursued and discussed, and of course she will hear from other colleagues in government who are leading on those policy areas.
We have 212 that's been withdrawn, so we now go to a virtual Pauline Latham. Pauline Latham.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Some charities are reporting a decline in the use of domestic abuse helplines during this lockdown as couples are entrapped with their abusers. This is a particular problem for those victims facing language barriers, where English is not their first language. What steps is the Home Secretary taking to ensure that those victims using their helplines are directed to specialist charities with bilingual call handlers such as Karma Nirvana?
Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend is absolutely right to highlight this, and there has been a great deal of work taking place working with domestic abuse, specialist domestic abuse organisations, and particularly those offering bilingual services. There has been a wide-ranging awareness campaign that has been launched. That is part of the You Are Not Alone campaign, and that is very specifically signposting victims to the specific and practical support that they need. We've provided £2 million to bolster those services, and that is for helplines, specifically for helplines and organisations that can bolster their own technological capacities, but also providing those direct practical skills to ensure victims remain protected.
Flynn.
Mr Speaker, we learn and understand our history in schools and museums, and we build statues for those who we deem worthy of our adoration. Does the Secretary of State agree that where there is a democratic desire to do so, statues of white men who enslaved and killed black men, women and children can and should be removed from our streets?
The Honourable Gentleman is right to raise this issue, and we live in an open democracy and a free society where we have the means to do that through democratic means at a local level through elected mayors and local councillors. And it is important that those processes are absolutely maintained so that people can have their voices heard, exercise their democratic rights and freedoms, but importantly stay within the rule of the law.
Lee Rowley.
For the question from a member for Dean South, does my right honourable friend agree with so many residents of North East Derbyshire who contacted me over the weekend that violence is never an acceptable method to pursue political ends?
My honourable friend is absolutely right. We are privileged to live in an open democratic country with many values entrenched not just in our constitution but also in a rules-based system. There is no justification for violence at all. And when it comes to exercising people's voices and obviously their particular issues and concerns, there are many avenues through which those voices and concerns can be raised and made at a local council level, and obviously that is the right way to approach these issues.
Topical 16 not here. In order to allow the safe exit of honourable members participating in this item of business and safe arrival of those participating in the next, I am suspending the House for 5 minutes. Order. Order. I have a short statement to make about select committees. On Tuesday, the 24th of March, the House passed an order allowing for virtual participation in select committee meetings and giving chairs associated powers to make reports. The order has effect until the 30th of June, but I was given a power under the order to extend it if necessary. Following representations from the Liaison Committee, I can notify the House today that I am extending the order until Thursday, the 17th of September. We now come to the urgent question. I call Jonathan Ashworth to ask his urgent question.
To ask the Secretary of State to make a statement on the R value and lockdown.
I now call the Secretary of State, Matt Hancock, for 3 minutes. Matt Hancock.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, for this opportunity to update the House on progress on our plans for controlling coronavirus. Thanks to the immense national effort on social distancing, as a country we've made real progress in reducing the number of new infections. And as we move out of lockdown, we look at all indicators to assess progress in tackling the virus. Last week's ONS infection survey estimated that the number of people who have had coronavirus in England fell from 139,000 between the 3rd and 16th of May to 53,000 between the 17th and 30th of May, a drop of over half. In terms of new cases, an ONS estimate released on Friday shows that there are now around 5,600 new cases each day within the community in England, a huge drop since the peak. The number of new fatalities each day is thankfully falling too. Today's figure records 55 fatalities, the lowest number since the 21st of March before lockdown began. They also show that there were no deaths recorded in London hospitals, which is a real milestone for the capital, which of course, in the early stages of this pandemic, faced the biggest peak. And yesterday we saw no recorded deaths in Scotland, which is very positive news for us all. Sadly, we do expect more fatalities in the future though, not least because the figures recorded at the weekend are typically lower. And what's more, Mr. Speaker, 55 deaths is still 55 too many. And hundreds of people are still fighting for their lives, and each death brings just as much sadness as when the figure was much higher in the peak. And I know that the thoughts of the whole House are with those families and communities who are grieving their loved ones. We of course also look at the R rate. SAGE confirmed on Friday that their estimate, taking into account 10 different models, is that R remains between 0.7 to 0.9, and that it is below 1 in every region of the country. This means that the number of new infections is expected to continue to fall. So there are encouraging trends on all of these critical measures. Mr. Speaker, coronavirus is in retreat across the land. Our plan is working, and these downward trends mean we can proceed with our plans, but we do so putting caution and safety first. Even at the peak of this pandemic, we protected the NHS and ensured it was not overwhelmed, and we will not allow a second peak that overwhelms the NHS. We're bearing down on the virus in our communities, aided by our new NHS test and trace system, which is growing every day. We're bearing down on infections in our hospitals, including the new measures to tackle nosocomial infection, like face masks for visitors, patients and staff. And finally, we're strengthening protections for our care homes, including getting tests to all elderly care home residents and staff. And I'm glad to be able to tell the House, Mr. Speaker, that David Pearson, the eminent social care expert who's previously led the social care body ADAS and who has decades of experience of leadership in both social care and public health, will be chairing our new social care task force to drive our COVID action plan yet further. David has an impressive track record, and I'm delighted that he'll be supporting us in leading this important work. Mr. Speaker, together we are getting this virus under control, and now more than ever we must not lose our resolve.
Shadow Secretary of State Jonathan Ashworth with 2 minutes.
What's just been said about the Social Care Task Force, may I say, it probably should have been set up some months ago, Mr. Speaker. Now, the government is easing restrictions, but even looking at their own tests, we know that PPE supplies are still not secured. We have dentists warning about PPE today. Tracing is still not fully operational. The Chief Operating Officer of Test and Trace warned it will not be fully operational until September. Testing is still not sufficient. We are still not routinely testing all NHS staff, whether asymptomatic or not, even though we know that will arrest the spread of the virus in hospitals. And the R value, according to the PHE Cambridge model, is close to 1 in many regions and is at or above 1 in the northwest and the southwest. And the modellers of from that model warn that this may result in the, quote, the decline in the national death rate being arrested by mid-June. Now, the British people have shown great resilience and fortitude in observing this lockdown and helping slow the spread of this deadly, horrific virus. But we have still had over 40,000 deaths. As the Secretary of State said, infections are still running at over 5,000 a day. We should proceed with caution, but many now fear that the Prime Minister is starting to throw caution to the wind. So can I put to him some specific requests? Will he agree to start publishing on a weekly basis the regional R value estimate alongside the national estimates? Does he agree that the voices of regions must be heard in future decisions about lockdown? And will he start including the various metro mayors, such as Andy Burnham and so on, in the COBRA meetings? Will he ensure this week that local authorities and GPs start receiving specific data about who has been tested positive so they can start putting in place area-based response? Will he issue this week written guidance on defining what a local lockdown is, how it will be enforced, and what resources and powers local authorities and agencies will be able to draw upon? And finally, Mr Speaker, we know that the more deprived an area is, there is a higher COVID mortality. There are pockets of deep deprivation in the northwest and in the southwest, parts of Cornwall, for example. What support will be given to those who are asked to isolate, financial support? And given we also know that BAME people are more at risk from COVID as well, will he now publish the Public Health England report into disparities in full, all the chapters, all the analysis, all the recommendations, because action to protect BAME people, especially BAME health and care staff, must be an urgent priority.
Secretary of State. Well, thank you very much, Mr Speaker. Just a couple of points in response. The first is that on PPE, we have turned around an incredibly difficult situation when demand for PPE shot up. And thanks to the incredible work of Lord Dighton, we now have good PPE supplies to all sectors, and we're working with the dentists to ensure that they too will be able to get the PPE that they need. He talks about testing, but he omitted to mention that we have hit every goal when it comes to our testing expansion, and we have now a capacity of more than 200,000 tests a day. And last week we were achieving that level of testing, which is itself a testament to the work of so many people in companies and in the public sector who've done just an incredible piece of work on testing. He picked on the results of one particular model that we look at, but he surely understands that actually the way that you get the best advice is looking at all different models rather than just one. I mentioned one other survey, which is actually based on data rather than modelling, the ONS survey. And I also told him already the SAGE view, taking into account all of the evidence, which is that R is below 1 in each region. As he said, we do publish R. He's quite right about the importance of working with local authorities and local leaders. I spoke to the Mayor of Greater Manchester on Friday about the higher rate of R, albeit assessed to be below 1, the higher rate of R in the northwest, and local leaders are incredibly important in terms of the local action that we'll be taking. He asked about local authorities and GPs getting access to data. We are working with them on the appropriate data that should flow to local authorities and GPs. He asked, quite rightly, for guidance on how local action will work, and that is an important early piece of work for the JBC, the Joint Biosecurity Centre. I'm glad that he's recognised the importance of the work that Public Health England has done and published on the disparities between people of different ethnic backgrounds and also other differences. For instance, the fact that older people are much more likely to die from COVID-19. It's very important that we base our response on all of this evidence.
Can I select Committee Chair Jeremy Hunt?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister's testing turnaround target does not apply to postal tests. Given that the majority of infections can happen less than a week after the person who gives you the virus develops symptoms, will he consider replacing postal testing with same-day delivery and collection of testing? If it's good enough for Amazon Prime, it should be good enough for NHS Test and Trace.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. He's quite right to raise this because the testing turnaround speeds are very important and they're improving. The answer is that we are intending increasingly to use the turnaround routes that have a 24-hour turnaround for the symptomatic testing that therefore needs this rapid response, and use the routes that have a slower turnaround for asymptomatic testing where the timing of the test is less important. That's the direction of travel, and we intend to solve the problem that he rightly highlights in that way.
We now head north of the border to Dr. Philippa Whitford, who is the SNP spokesperson, with 1 minute. Dr. Whitford.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The R number is close to 1 across England and may even be above that in some areas. As the R number reflects lockdown changes made a couple of weeks ago, does the Secretary of State not accept the need to assess the impact of sending people back to work and school before making further changes to lockdown? With Serco admitting their tracing system won't be fully operational until September, would he not have been better investing in public health systems instead of a private company with no expertise? Why are the test results from the commercial labs still not being sent to local GPs and public health teams to allow contact tracing? And finally, we all recognise the economic impact of lockdown. But does he not accept the worst thing for the economy would be a second wave needing a second lockdown?
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Well, as a clinician, I think the Honourable Lady will recognise that taking into account all of the evidence of the rate of transmission is incredibly important. And I think that it is an error and it's wrong and it's beneath the normal standards of her questioning to focus just on one report rather than on all of the reports. And I hope that when she speaks to people in Scotland and across the whole country, that she will take into account all of the evidence rather than just focus on one report. And I just urge her to do that because that is important for the public communications. The other point I'd make is that the NHS Test and Trace programme is being built at incredible pace. As the Prime Minister said, he committed that we would get it up and running for the 1st of June, and we've delivered that, and that it will be world-class, and we will deliver that. But we couldn't deliver it without public and private sectors working together. And I think the divisiveness that just comes through from the other side is a real mistake in these difficult times. Instead, everybody should be working together.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Parents in my Warrington South constituency have been in touch overnight to say how disappointed they were by a decision taken by local councillors yesterday afternoon not to open primary schools today. Does the Secretary of State agree with me that local authorities need to look at a number of local factors, not just regional R data, for a wider area when taking important decisions on getting our children back to school?
Well, I do, absolutely, and it is particularly a mistake to look at just one model rather than the overall assessment of R in each part of the country, which is assessed to be below 1 in each area, and therefore, with the number of new infections coming down, we can take the plan forward, and we ought to take the plan forward, because the education of children matters, as well as, of course, controlling the virus.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The government have repeatedly said that lockdown will only be eased when the R rate is below 1 and the threat level is coming down. The threat level is still at 4, and as the Right Honourable Gentleman has said, in the North West there are some calculations of the R rate that have it above 1. Many of my constituents are really worried about this, yet the government's accelerating plans to end the lockdown more quickly than it announced that it would. Why?
Thank you very much. We are continuing with the plan that we have, which is cautious and takes a safety-first approach, and based on all of the information, not just, as she quite rightly pointed out, just one part of the information. We said that we would take the next steps when the 5 tests have been met. They have been met. R is below 1, and the other 4 tests have also been met, and that's why we're able to proceed. And the evidence that we're increasingly seeing of the number of new cases coming down, and thankfully the number of fatalities coming down, these are good news that demonstrate that the plan is working.
Harriet Baldwin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and we're also grateful to our NHS and care workers. And so many people have made so many difficult sacrifices during this period of lockdown. They are furious to see the lack of social distancing in some of the protests that took place over the weekend, and they want to know what impact that might have had on the reproduction rate of the virus.
Secretary of State.
Well, I thank my right honourable friend for this question. It is incredibly important that people follow the social distancing rules, and the demonstrations that we saw over the weekend, where they did not follow the social distancing rules, risk increasing the spread of the virus. That is the clear scientific evidence, and it is a mistake, Mr. Speaker, for people to participate in demonstrations that help to spread this vile disease. Instead, we should all be acting to do our bit to reduce that spread.
We're going up to the northwest with Barbara Keeley.
Mr. Speaker, with the R number above 1 in the northwest in one model, we need action to prevent a second wave of infections and deaths. Now, the Secretary of State has talked about local lockdowns, but can he commit to Public Health England supplying more local information on the spread of the virus to assist that? And can he also tell us whether there will be additional powers and financial support for areas covered by a local lockdown, as called for yesterday by our Greater Manchester Mayor, Andy Burnham?
Yes, we hope very much to be able to publish more and more granular, localised information and work with local leaders in order to deliver on what's needed to act upon it.
John Rambo.
Given his great success in expanding the number of tests, will we soon have more precise and accurate R figures along with the other information now accumulated? And is there a danger in interpreting back trends that they are unreliable because differential test rates?
The answer is yes and yes. It's the survey testing that is the most reliable way of assessing the prevalence of the disease and its downward trajectory, and that's because that takes into account a randomised approach to working out where the disease is, much like an opinion poll that we are familiar with in this House. Because as the amount of testing has gone up, so inevitably more cases have been found. And that's a good thing, of course, that more cases have been found, but we need to know the prevalence, which is best done by surveys.
Right north of the border with Kirsty Oswald. Kirsty.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Secretary of State has just spoken about the importance of people following the rules. It's clear that Dominic Cummings' rule-breaking trip across England has undermined the little confidence there was in the UK government's public health messaging. Does the Secretary of State appreciate the harm that's been done by the outrageous spin and shape-shifting on this? And what's he going to do to repair the damage?
No, I don't think that's got anything to do with it. I think actually the most important thing is that people follow the social distancing rules, and I think that should apply even if they have a strong and heartfelt case to make in a public discussion such as at the weekend.
Stephen Crabb.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The success of the government strategy rests to an enormous extent on public support and consent for the lockdown measures. So can I ask my right honourable friend, what advice is he receiving from his behavioural experts on the viability, the sustainability of localised lockdowns? It's a challenging thing to set the country on a path to easing restrictions and then to want to dial it back again.
Well, of course, it's important to ensure people are fully informed of the reasons why we may need to take action in a particular local area, and that's a very important part of the consideration. And making sure that local bodies, for instance local directors of public health, are fully engaged is is an important way of doing that. And of course, in the case of Wales, where my right honourable friend represents, that this is done through the devolved nations with their responsibilities locally for public health.
Mr. Speaker, while the R number is one indicator of infection, it's only reliable at regional level. Currently, directors of public health tell me that they are only receiving high-level reports when what they actually need is more localised information, with data relating to the number and location of cases and when infection occurred. This information is vital to stopping transmission, especially as restrictions are lifted. Can the Secretary of State tell me by which date this information will be available to local authorities in order to inform their local outbreak plans?
As soon as practical.
We now come to Jack Brereton.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Many of my constituents in Stoke-on-Trent South are now sending their children back to school or will soon be going back to work in places like retail. They want confidence they are doing so doing the right thing for their families. Could my right honourable friend assure me that my constituents that each step that the government is taking is based on the advice and science?
Absolutely, Mr. Speaker. Throughout this, we've based our decisions on the science and the scientific advice, of course taking into account all considerations, but the scientific advice, for instance, from SAGE, is so important, and it is absolutely critical that we could take into account all of the science, and that's why I think that it's a mistake for people to pick on one particular report and focus on that, as opposed to looking at all of the science in the round.
Ruth Capri.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. People living in residential care support for learning and other disabilities are at high risk of catching COVID. But it's good to know that in Hounslow, those living in residential care have not yet contracted COVID. But unlike settings for older people, they cannot access testing kits. So when will the government ensure that all residential care settings, including those for under 65-year-olds, be able to access testing?
Mr. Speaker, the Honourable Lady is quite right to ask this question. It's on clinical advice, in fact the scientific advice that we were just discussing, that we took the whole home testing for residents and staff to older care homes for older people first, because you are 70 times more likely to die from COVID-19 if you're older than younger, and it is a very, very significant age gradient. However, now that we have got tests to all of the eligible elderly care homes, we are now moving to delivering the same for people of working age.
Red Clark.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On that very point, the Secretary of State is quite right that it's important to protect our older citizens, and it is true that they are able to get tests for older people themselves and for workers in care homes. But that is not the case for people who live or work in retirement villages and supported accommodation. Will the Secretary of State intervene to correct that anomaly immediately so that we can protect all of our older and vulnerable people?
Yes, of course, that's taken into account in the clinical decision over the order of priority for testing, and my right honourable friend makes a very important point that I will ensure is taken away and looked at, and to check that we have people in those settings outside of formal social care, often not CQC registered, but still with a much higher proportion of vulnerable and elderly people who are vulnerable to this disease in them. And I'll make sure that that's properly looked into. And if I may, Mr. Speaker, I will write to the chair of the Science Select Committee on this precise point.
Kevin Brennan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Secretary of State says they're taking a safety-first approach in government. And yet, Professor John Edmonds has expressed concern that if we relax, the infection will come back very fast. In Wales, there's been a more cautious approach to allowing people, or suggesting that people should be able to travel such long distances, as we saw the weekend before last in Dorset. I mean, what's he going to do if the R number does drift back above 1?
Well, I don't want to see the R number go above 1. I spoke to Professor Edmonds at the weekend, as it happens, and if he, like I, saw what the professor had to say at the weekend, he said that, quite rightly, a cautious approach is what's needed, but there is scope to be able to allow some opening up according to the plan that we've got.
Mark Pritchard.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Of course, the international R rate matters too, and I welcome the Prime Minister hosting the Global Vaccine Summit in the UK last week, which raised an astonishing $88 billion. But given the UK is the largest contributor to the Gavi Vaccine Alliance, can I ask the Secretary of State what support this government is doing for low-income and developing countries, particularly in the Commonwealth and overseas territories?
This is an incredibly important point, Mr. Speaker, because being able to get a vaccine everywhere around the world is incredibly important to us here at home. Of course, our top priority is access to the vaccine for the citizens of this country, but we're also using our aid budget in order to ensure that should a vaccine work and become available, we can not only deliver it here, but be good global citizens and put, as he says, we put more into this than any other country on this planet.
Laura Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Professor Edmonds also said yesterday that the R value was largely being driven by outbreaks in care homes and hospitals. Despite his statement today, we know that there are still some care homes, including in my own constituency, where residents and staff have yet to be tested. How can we effectively bring down the R rate without regular testing? And will he commit to regular testing in all care settings, including the under 65s and those with learning disabilities?
Well, she's absolutely right that testing in care homes is important. I'm very pleased that we hit the target. My team hit their target of ensuring that all care homes have access to tests by Saturday, which was the target that we set for elderly care homes. That's almost 9,000 care homes got kits for all of their staff and residents to be tested. And the important thing is that did not show a huge amount of infections that we didn't previously otherwise know about. And I'm absolutely delighted that David Pearson, who it's worth the Shadow Secretary of State acknowledging, has been working with us throughout this whole period. David Pearson will now be taking a leadership role in driving forward this work to protect our care homes yet further.
A bit more.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Quite rightly, many of my constituents have contacted me regarding concerns of mass gatherings and lack of social distancing, which we unfortunately witnessed in Ilkley last weekend when many visitors came to enjoy the sunshine. Can my right honourable friend confirm that the R rate is below 1 in West Yorkshire? And will he also consider local lockdown if appropriate, so that if we do see a flare-up in infections in one part of the country, we can take action where necessary?
I want to protect all of the residents of Ilkley from this disease, and as we've got the number of new infections each day right down to between 5,000 and 6,000 according to the ONS each day, a long way below where it was at the peak, and as the number of deaths has fallen, so I want to keep that down, and where there is evidence of a specific cluster or flare-up, we take local action there, and that will help to protect the residents of Ilkley and elsewhere in Yorkshire and across the country, so that we can then safely release other lockdown measures whilst keeping the community safe.
Liz Twist.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Following on nicely, what local resources and funding will be put in place for local authorities to deal with local lockdowns where they are needed?
Yes, we've already allocated £300 million to precisely this task. And of course, making sure that local authorities are properly funded for their role, which is a very important role in local action, is an important part of the task.
Anthony Higginbotham.
The Secretary of State will be aware of the media reports saying that the R rate in the North West is above 1, which has understandably caused concern to my constituents in Burnley. Could he reassure them and people across the North West that the R rate is below 1 in the North West, but also that we have to look at all of the evidence, and on that evidence we are still defeating this virus?
That's right. I set out some of the evidence in my statement, and Mr. Speaker, it is very important that we look at the overall base of evidence and we take scientific advice on that. There are 10 models that go into SAGE, and it is important that the media reports the facts, which are that if you take into account all of these models, then R is below 1, according to SAGE, in each region of the country. Now, of course, scientific models will come out with different results, and it's quite right that the scientists should publish and discuss those, and that's how science advances. But it's also important that the media play their part responsibly, and I can reassure the residents of Burnley and elsewhere in the North West that our overall assessment is that R is below 1 in the North West and everywhere else in the country. But of course we keep this closely monitored at all times.
We now go north of the border with Neil Gray. Neil Gray.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can the Secretary of State advise whether the R number has been rising or has fallen since the Prime Minister announced without consultation and with a day's notice that people should get back to work in England? And given that some reports suggest some areas of England have an R number at or close to 1, what consultation has he had with devolved nations, and when will he publish details on what local lockdowns will look like to ensure the virus is contained?
Mr. Speaker, I've already answered all of these questions, and the estimate from the scientists, taking into account all of the evidence, is that R is below 1. And the honourable member may shake his head, but if he asks the same question, he's going to get the same answer.
Andrew Jones.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I strongly welcome the progress made with testing. In Harrogate and Esborough, we've had mobile testing at the council-owned hydro unit. But in this pandemic, we're seeing BAME members of our community being disproportionately impacted. So what steps is he undertaking to provide further testing for those who are most vulnerable?
Well, of course, the use of the testing capability that we now have, which is one of the biggest in the world, it's the biggest testing capability in Europe. This means that we can focus the testing where it is most clinically needed, and reports like PHE's report into the impact of the disease on different parts of the population, whether that's by age or by sex or by ethnic background, are incredibly important in making that assessment. And then where the clinical judgment is that tests should be used specifically for one group because they have a high risk, then we will follow that clinical judgment.
We go to Wales with Geraint Davies. Geraint Davies.
Mr. Speaker, given the varying rates of infection across both England and Wales and the need to isolate COVID, will the Secretary of State now adopt the Welsh guidance that people should normally travel more than 5 miles from their home in order to stop people travelling from high infection areas to low infection areas, thereby spreading the virus unnecessarily?
We talk to the Welsh Government all of the time about making sure that the public health matters that are devolved are exercised in as coordinated way as reasonably possible, and I fully respect the Welsh Government's capability at making these sorts of assessments for Wales.
Darren Henry.
Mr. Speaker, can my right honourable friend assure me that steps to ease lockdown will be taken cautiously and carefully so that we can examine the effect on R in the different parts of the country before proceeding?
Well, my honourable friend is absolutely right to raise this. Of course we proceed cautiously. That's why we take steps in turn to see the effect. And the good news is that the evidence thus far is the steps we've taken so far have coincided with a continued reduction in the incidence of the virus, and that's why it is safe to proceed on the plan that we've set out.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. How can it be that local authorities
when we're coming out of lockdown and starting to relax some of the restrictions, that they don't know what they're expected to do in the event of a local outbreak, and they don't know what powers they're going to be given. How can it be that the government can only say, we'll tell them when it's practicably possible?
Mr. Speaker, I'm afraid I don't recognise that picture at all. The local directors of public health have been heavily engaged in addressing local outbreaks throughout this, and in particular, for instance, in the last few weeks, there have been outbreaks locally that have then been addressed with a leadership role played locally by the local director of public health. And as I said, maybe he wasn't listening to the answer given to his honourable friend, Mr. Speaker, that we've also put £300 million into local authorities to assist them to make sure that they have that capability on the ground.
Steve Bryan.
The work that PHE have done with Cambridge to understand the R rate on a regional level is very welcome. It might yet, of course, prove invaluable if needed. But can my right honourable friend say how local is realistically possible? I think I'm right in saying that we couldn't hone in on Winchester as an example if we needed to stamp on an outbreak. And would other factors come into place, such as how effective an area was on the test and trace programme, for instance?
Yes, absolutely. As I tried to say in my opening statement, R is one of many measures that you've got to look at. The number of new infections, i.e. the level of new infections as opposed to the rate of change, is also important and more directly measurable both through test results and through the surveys that we discussed earlier. And of course, both the surveys and in particular the number of test results and the number of people presenting for testing, which you get from the test and trace programme, are much more granular local data that can give you a view of a local outbreak. And then if there's evidence of a local outbreak, then you can go and do asymptomatic testing in that community in order to find out how serious the problem is locally. So there's a whole suite of tools at our disposal.
Jim Shannon.
Speaker, and does the Secretary of State not agree that whilst the United Kingdom and Great Britain and Northern Ireland must move forward together, that regional variation of the R numbers will mean differentiation? And what discussions and input will the Secretary of State and Government have with regional authorities to ensure that UK-wide understanding, and will all R numbers be calculated using the same scientific criteria?
The answer to the last question is emphatically yes, and I have regular discussions and exchanges both with the First Minister in Northern Ireland and also with my opposite number, Robin Swan, and we work to ensure that the response to this virus across the whole United Kingdom is as closely aligned as it reasonably can be, respecting the different impact of the disease in different parts. And thankfully, the impact of the disease in Northern Ireland has been less than the rest of the country, and long may it remain so.
Sir Graham Brady. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. What assessments has my right honourable friend made of the progress in countries that operated social distancing at 1.5 metres or 1 metre? And when does he think we may have a review of those measures in this country?
Well, this is constantly kept under review. In fact, I was reading some of the most recent science on this over the weekend. Of course, the interaction of the distance put in place and the other measures, for instance, on mask wearing and ventilation in particular, are what matters for the progress of the disease. Because the problem here is not the rule, whether it's 2 metres or any different particular distance. The problem is that the virus transmits, especially face-to-face, less so if you're side-to-side or back-to-back, in close quarters. And of course, being outside helps as well.
Wendy Chamberlain.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I welcome today's news from the Scottish Government that we have had a second day in Scotland of no additional deaths from coronavirus. But I am concerned about the level of testing, particularly in a community setting, and that it's nowhere near capacity. If we've not got comprehensive testing, how can we have confidence in the R number? So how is the Secretary of State working with the Scottish Government to ensure that all the testing capacity, including drive-through centres, is being used?
Yes, absolutely, Mr. Speaker. I work closely with the Scottish Government to do everything we can so that they can increase their testing capacity. Part of the testing programme, as she's mentioned, the drive-through centres, is essentially UK-wide. Likewise, the postal testing services, and then the hospital-based testing is run, of course, by the Scottish NHS and therefore is devolved. This requires a higher level of coordination, and we across the UK, in England, we have the highest level of testing, and we do everything possible to help the Scottish Government to get their testing capacity up.
Andrew Bowie.
Mr. Speaker, no new deaths in Scotland, no new deaths in Northern Ireland, and no new deaths in London hospitals. And whilst I agree with my right honourable friend that even one death from coronavirus is one too many, does he not agree with me that this is evidence that the whole UK approach and the measures adopted across the entire United Kingdom at the beginning of this virus are working, and this is reason to be hugely positive?
So absolutely right that there has been very encouraging progress, and all of the significant data point in the same direction, which is downwards, and that is incredibly important. It's a testament to the efforts of everybody across the whole United Kingdom, because everybody has played their part in the social distancing, and I think that the more that we do this as one United Kingdom, the better. And of course there is sometimes substantive reasons for local variation, for instance sometimes north of the border, but ultimately this country is coming through this and we are winning the battle against this disease.
Rachel Master.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Local directors of public health need comprehensive, granulated data in order to do their job. Currently, there are holes in the data which they are receiving, particularly on the testing, in order to then follow through on tracing. So when, not soon, but when will they actually receive that comprehensive data together with a local R value in order to then keep our communities safe?
Well, the thing is, Mr. Speaker, they get data now. We want them to get better data. We'll keep improving the data flows, and it's as simple as that.
We're now going down to see Stephen Metcalfe. Stephen Metcalfe.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As we control the R rate and we move forward, can I welcome the steps that are being taken to reduce restrictions for the most vulnerable in society? Will my right honourable friend confirm that these steps are being taken in line with scientific advice and in the safest way possible?
Yes, that's absolutely right. And I pay tribute to my honourable friend who makes this case for the evidence being the basis of policy and following and being guided by the science, as we have done throughout this crisis. He makes the case very eloquently. It's very important, because that is the best way that you can get the best possible response in what are inevitably very difficult circumstances.
Going back to north of the border with Richard Thompson. Richard Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We know that the Secretary of State doesn't want to see the R rate rise above 1. None of us do. But the high-profile recent mixed messages which have come from his government might well lead to that happening anyway. Under those circumstances, is he prepared, if necessary, to reintroduce restrictions on movement and activity? And in those circumstances, will he do whatever it takes to persuade the Chancellor to continue with financial support to the employed and self-employed for so long as it's necessary?
Thank you very much. I'm very grateful to the honourable gentleman for that question, for the manner in which he asks it. We have always said that we are prepared to reintroduce measures if that is necessary. And I think he's already seen from the Chancellor one of the most generous packages of support in the world for people dealing with and coping with the consequences, in some cases incredibly difficult and painful consequences of this disease.
Greg Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As my right honourable friend works with medical and scientific advisers to cautiously lift lockdown measures, what hope can he give the millions of grandparents in this country that they too may soon be able to play a full role in their grandchildren's lives, particularly those engaged in childcare to enable parents to go to work?
Mr. Speaker, like anybody who has a heart at all, I yearn for grandparents to be able to see their grandchildren. My own children haven't seen their grandparents. In fact, my own children saw their grandmother at a social distance, outdoors, appropriately, rigorously according to the rules, for the first time this weekend, and it was a real joy. First time in months and months and months. But they haven't seen their other grandparents and of course they're not allowed to hug them yet. And of course I'm with my honourable friend and you, no doubt, Mr. Speaker, and everybody else in this House in wanting to see a restoration of that basic human yearning.
We go to Manchester with Andrew Gwynn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And obviously the concern over the R rate in Greater Manchester on one measure has focused attention on possible local lockdowns, which would have a financial impact on people who are unable to work from home. In those circumstances, will the government consider a form of local furlough for those people whose workplaces may be closed down or who are unable to get to work?
Well, the full furlough scheme operates nationally now, and I'm sure that the Treasury will have heard his idea for suggestion. But of course, we don't need it now because the full furlough is in operation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We know the significance of the R rate being 1, but what level does the R rate have to get to, and for how long, for the government to initiate a response and bring restrictions back? And then what does it need to reduce to, and for how long, before those new restrictions are then removed?
Well, Mr. Speaker, the reason that R is important and having R below 1 is important is that that is the rate at which the number of new infections continues to fall. So long as R is below 1, the question is how fast that's falling. And the number of new transmissions is currently, for each person who has it, is currently on average less than 1. So R is below 1, and therefore the number of transmissions is falling. We don't have a specific figure or target for R. We just want to keep it below 1, and we want to keep the number of new transmissions falling. And in the first instance, our first response to new outbreaks will be the local action that we've been talking about for much of this session, and that is much preferable to a reinvigoration of the need for a national lockdown.
Bradshaw.
If it isn't because we locked down too late or any of the government's other blunders, why does he think we have the highest excess death rate in the world?
I'm not sure which evidence the honourable member is pointing to, but I'd be very happy to talk to him afterwards.
Scott Benson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The circulation of an unofficial R rate figure of 1.6 for Blackpool and the publication of this by the local press has created a great deal of alarm in my constituency. The fact that this figure was adjusted to 0.5 only days later just demonstrates the difficulties we can have in believing unofficial statistics and in taking these out of context. Can my right honourable friend confirm that R rate figures are only accurate at a regional level, and does he agree with me that the media have an obligation to report data accurately and within context to make sure that members of the public are properly informed?
Yes, I do. I think my honourable friend makes the point extremely strongly, and the people of Blackpool should be proud that they elected him in December, because he made this case very, very clearly. It is true in Blackpool and of the example he cites, but it's also true in the wider North West, as I'm sure you feel greatly, Mr. Speaker, that a single report should not be taken out of context, and all science should be looked at, and members across all sides of the House should respect that if they really think that they're respecting the science.
We're now going north of the border with Dave Dugan. Dave Dugan.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The Secretary of State has made very clear the importance of cooperation between the various health directorates in all four nations of the United Kingdom, and I think we all welcome that. What we also need to see is cooperation in other government departments. And can he advise me what discussions he's had with his Treasury colleagues about the need to vary furlough across the United Kingdom to a varying degree when we come out of lockdown at different rates?
Mr. Speaker, one of the reasons that it's valuable to move together as one single country is that we have one overall economy in this country, and economic policy is, of course, for the whole country. That's one of the many reasons why we are far stronger together. And it's very important that as the Scottish Government makes its judgments on what's best for Scotland, they, of course, take that into account.
Caroline Nance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My home constituency of Eastbourne, I'm very pleased to say, has a low incidence of infection, but it has a high number of care homes and a high number of residents who've been shielding. Equally, it is a tourist destination. With lockdown easing, what reassurances can my right honourable friend give to concerned residents that we are moving forward safely?
Well, it is very important for those engaged in the tourism industry to follow the guidance really as carefully as they possibly can on social distancing, always to follow those rules, and to make sure that that is in place. And as we manage to open things at the right pace, in due course, cautiously and safely, it's incumbent also on an industry like the tourism industry to make sure they follow guidelines like that. The next proposed step, subject to formal confirmation, is the opening of non-essential retail. Non-essential retailers will have to follow clear guidelines about making sure that their shops are safe and that they don't add to the spread of the disease. And then if we're able to make further steps after that, it's so important that a whole industry, like the tourism industry, helps everybody to help them by following those sorts of rules.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I've received this letter from a little boy called Charlie. He's clinically extremely vulnerable and has been shielding with his family for around 11 weeks. He wants to know why it is that non-vulnerable people can be allowed to have unlimited exercise wherever and whenever they want, whilst people who are still shielding feel trapped in their own homes without even 30 minutes to go outside. Now that we've stopped clapping for carers, would he agree with me that for just once a day we could stay home for shielders?
I think the Honourable Lady asks a very important question, and I'd say this to all those who are shielding. We did make a change to recommend going outside. I know that some people were very worried about doing that, but it is safe to do so, and do so in a safe way, staying 2 metres from others. The shielding guidelines are there for your own protection. They're because you're particularly you're particularly at risk if you catch the disease, and they are the guidelines for how you can stay safe. We appreciate that they have a very significant impact on those who are shielding, and we're always looking at what we can do to make the lives of those who are shielding better and to improve the guidance all the time.
Can I urge the government to follow the lead of other European countries and move to a 1 metre social distancing rule? Because that's the only way we're going to save millions of jobs in hospitality over the next few months.
Well, we always keep these things under review. The challenge is that face-to-face, the impact of being at 1 metre is, in terms of the transmission of the disease, is much greater than at a further distance.
Heading to marvellous Manchester with Afzal Khan. Afzal Khan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Many of my constituents were deeply concerned to read the high R rate in the Northwest. In the same week, they were told to send their children back to school. Has the Secretary of State made any assessment of the impact of reopening schools on the R rates in the Northwest?
Yes, and I've reconfirmed this with the Chief Medical Officer. It is safe to take the steps that we recommended to open schools for reception year, year 1 and year 6 right across the country, and I'm glad to be able to reassure the Honourable Gentleman, and I hope he can then reassure his constituents and others across the North West that the assessment of SAGE, taking into account all of the evidence, is that R is below 1 in all regions.
Gaga Mahindra.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I remind the House firstly that it's Carers Week this week? Can my right honourable friend assure me that SAGE, when providing advice to ministers, looks at a range of information to ensure that it is presenting an overall view and that its belief is that the R rate is below 1 in all regions?
Yes, that's absolutely right, and it's just so important that we take into account all of the evidence and all of the studies that are published and not just wrongly focus on one.
Some of the people who've had the toughest time during these months are the people who work in care homes. They've had to deal with things that they never thought that they would have to, including keeping family members apart from the people they've been looking after, even when they're dying. In Wales, the Welsh Government has decided to give everybody working in a care home, including chefs and ancillary workers, £500 as a bonus. can I please ask him to try and make sure that the Chancellor of the Exchequer doesn't tax it?
I will. I'll talk to the Chancellor about it. It's obviously a question for another department than mine.
William Wright. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's essential that the spread of COVID-19 is understood in different settings, such as hospitals and care homes. So will my right honourable friend confirm that the R rate can be unduly distorted at a regional level by these figures and that local lockdown measures should be used very carefully?
Well, I would just say that in the first instance, where we have taken local action, often it can be in a care home or in a hospital, and that would be the action that's needed, and it's been successful where in many cases in ensuring that then an outbreak where you see a rise in the number of new cases does not then transmit into the community. And so, in the first instance, local action is very local. It's in a single hospital or a care home. I think understanding that as the root, as the starting point for local action is important in thinking about how we take this forward.
Stephen Flynn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We've already heard about the good news from Scotland where we've gone 2 days without a death, but we do need to be careful and also mindful of the fact that the R rate may increase in the future, as indeed others in the Chamber have concerns for their areas. But can the Secretary of State give a commitment that if the R rate does rise and lockdown needs to be re-implemented, that he will make every effort to ensure that the Chancellor ensures that businesses, employees and the self-employed receive the financial support they deserve?
The Honourable Gentleman asked an extremely reasonable question, and I hope that he sees that the government has been incredibly front foot about ensuring that that sort of provision is available and has been available right from the start of this crisis, and we have one of the most generous schemes in the world.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd also like to pay tribute to all the many carers throughout the country who are people who are just relatives but are looking after someone through love and are unpaid for that. But because they don't see themselves as carers, they often don't have the information that they might otherwise need. Would my right honourable friend see whether there's anything more he can do to work with colleagues in councils and, of course, the relevant departments to ensure that they have access to everything that they need? Because carers are a massively important part of making sure that the R rate is controlled.
Yes, Mr. Speaker. I think the whole House will join me and my honourable friend in thanking all carers, paid and unpaid, this Carers Week. And this Carers Week is so different to normal because of what's happened during coronavirus. And one of the things we've seen during coronavirus is that people have got together to celebrate and thank our carers right across the board. He's absolutely right to raise the point that he does, and I will certainly look into it.
Going back to the north of the border with Neil Hanby. Neil Hanby.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. No one wants to see the R number go above 1, hence the robust questioning the Secretary of State is facing. This weekend, the government's incongruous messaging continued, where SAGE member John Edmonds told Andrew Marr that the decision not to lock down earlier had cost a lot of lives. Later in the show, the Secretary of State dismissed this view in the face of Channel 4's Dispatches programme and the growing number of scientific experts who are warning that the government's premature relaxation of lockdown could see a significant second wave of infection. If the government is no longer following the science provided by their own advisors, whose advice are they following?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm afraid the Honourable Gentleman has misquoted Professor Edmonds, and I think he should go and look at what was actually said.
Final question, John Morrissey.
Can my right honourable friend join me in praising the carers in Beaconsfield for their tireless work? And can my right honourable friend confirm that the only reason we are now able to consider local lockdowns is because of our testing capabilities, along with NHS Test and Trace, that are helping to build a more accurate picture of what's going on in different parts of the country?
Yes, I'd like to thank the carers of Beaconsfield for the work that they have done through this crisis and before, and to thank them and tell them that the value and the esteem with which we hold them is so high, and we are so grateful for what they do. And I'd also like to say to her that she's quite right that you simply couldn't have a localised approach and therefore the safety of reducing safely and cautiously the overall lockdown measures without a significant testing capacity. And thanks to the teamwork of the NHS, Public Health England, and many private companies, we have built the largest coronavirus testing capacity in Europe from almost nothing. And it is a testament to so many people, to the team effort, and to the way that the country has rallied behind this need.
In order to allow safe exit of honourable members participating in this item of business and safe arrival of those participating in the next, I am suspending the House for 5 minutes. Order.
As long as Priti's ready. Order! Order! Seems to me that there might be too many members in places in the House where they're not properly distanced. Could they please not be there? Thank you. We now come to the statement by the Home Secretary. Priti Patel.
With permission, Madam Deputy Speaker, I would like to make a statement on public order. Like all members of this House, I was sickened at George Floyd's tragic death. His treatment at the hands of the United States Police was appalling and speaks to the sense of injustice experienced by minority communities around the world. I fully appreciate the strength of feeling over his senseless killing and the inequality that black people can sadly still face and the deep-seated desire for change. I know that it is that sense of injustice that has driven people to take to the UK streets to protest. This government is clear that racism and discrimination in any form have no place in our society, and we will do whatever is required to eradicate it. Of course, there is more we can do. There is more that we should all do to combat inequalities across society, to support those seeking social justice, better life chances, and offer hope where all too often, too many are confronted by despair. And it is right in any democracy, in an open and free society, that we advance these issues in a constructive, sensitive, and a responsible way. Madam Deputy Speaker, this government understands the importance of the right to protest. In normal circumstances, a large and peaceful protest would not be of concern to the authorities, because we do live in a great country where our right to protest and our right to have our voices heard is integral to our fundamental democratic freedoms. The right to come together and express our views peacefully remains one of the cornerstones of our great democracy. Members across this House share an enduring commitment to uphold liberty and freedom of expression, but under the basis of respecting the rule of law. But as our nation battles coronavirus, these are not normal circumstances. So to protect us all and to stop the spread of this deadly disease, any large gatherings of people are currently unlawful. We cannot afford to forget that we are still in the grip of an unprecedented national health emergency that has tragically claimed over 40,000 lives. So the severe public health risk forces me to continue to urge the public not to attend future protests. The government's scientific and medically led advice remains clear and consistent. No matter how important the cause, protesting in large numbers at this exceptional time is illegal, and doing so puts everyone's lives at risk. Now, Madam Deputy Speaker, let me turn to an operational update. Around 200 protests took place across the country over the weekend, attended by over 100,000 people. As many as 137,500 people have now attended Black Lives Matter's protests across the UK. While the majority were peaceful, a lawless minority of protesters have regrettably turned to violence. The worst violence flared in London on Saturday evening, with missiles and flares being thrown at police officers outside Downing Street. Officers in protective equipment were deployed to arrest the culprits and to clear the area. At least 35 officers have now been injured during the protests in the capital. I salute their bravery and wish them a swift recovery. The thugs and criminals responsible are already being brought to justice. This is a fluid situation, Madam Deputy Speaker, but as of this morning, the total number of arrests stood at 135. As the ugly tally of officer assault shows, Madam Deputy Speaker, some protesters regrettably turned to violent and abusive behaviour at the weekend. This hooliganism is utterly indefensible. There is no justification for it. There is no excuse for pelting flares at brave officers, throwing bikes at police horses, attempting to disrespect the cenotaph, or vandalising the statue of Winston Churchill, one of the greatest protectors of our freedoms who has ever lived. It is not for mobs to tear down statues and cause criminal damage in our streets, and it is not acceptable for thugs to racially abuse black police officers for doing their jobs. The criminals responsible for these unlawful and reckless acts are betraying the very cause that they purport to serve. These protests are about injustice, but by attacking our courageous police, they are acting in a wholly unjust way. When I became Home Secretary, I vowed to back the police. I said that I would stand with the brave men and women of our police and security services and against the criminals. And I stand by that today, proudly and without apology. Because as we saw at the weekend, we ask our frontline police officers to do the most difficult of jobs, to run towards danger, to ensure that we are not in danger, to put their own lives on the line to protect the public, to uphold the rule of law and the rights of individuals against the disorder that we have seen in recent days. By doing this, the police in our country give us all the very security we need to live our lives as we choose. That is an essential part of our freedom. Because violence, disorder and crime, it blights communities and society as a whole. So the police need to know that they have a Prime Minister, a Home Secretary and a government that stands with them, and that we will give them the tools and powers and the resources they need to keep us safe. And they do. Police funding has had its biggest uplift in a decade, increasing by over £1 billion. And we are recruiting an additional 20,000 police officers to keep our streets and our country safe. They all have my full support in upholding the rule of law and in tackling violence, vandalism and disorderly criminal behaviour. And I could not be clearer that I want to see the violent minority responsible arrested and brought to justice. Madam Deputy Speaker, I agree with the many peaceful protesters that racism has absolutely no place in our society. Black lives matter, but police brutality in the United States is no excuse for the violence against our brave police officers at home. So to the quiet, law-abiding majority who are appalled by this violence and have continued to live their lives within the rules, I hear you. To the police who have been subject to the most dreadful abuse, you have my full backing as you act proportionately, fairly and courageously to maintain law and order. And to the criminal minority who have subverted this cause with their thuggery, I simply say this: your behaviour is shameful and you will face justice. I commend this statement to the House.
Thank you. Nick Thomas-Symonds.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I'd like to thank the Home Secretary for her statement and for advance sight of it. Like everyone in the House, I was appalled by the killing of George Floyd. His fateful words, "I can't breathe," not only haunt us, but have also been a catalyst for people across America and the world to say that the racism that continues to shame everyday life must stop. People in our communities with lived experiences and family legacies of the prejudice black people in the United Kingdom face have bravely stepped forward. And I want to be absolutely clear, I hear you. And not that it should need saying, but Black Lives Matter. Words are important, but we cannot allow this moment of global demand for justice to pass without action. And we on these benches will be at the forefront of calls for change. What is never the solution, though, Madam Deputy Speaker, is violence and vandalism. The vast majority of protesters are peaceful, but some of the actions we have seen from a minority are unacceptable. I condemn those who have attacked the police, and I want to pay tribute to the police officers putting themselves in harm's way over the weekend, and I hope the Home Secretary will update us on the condition of the 27 officers injured, including one in hospital and the injured protester. When it comes to the statue of Edward Colston, I do not condone an act of criminal damage to remove it, but I will not miss a public statue of a slave trader, and it should have been taken down many years ago. At a time when politicians and public health experts are rightly stressing the need for caution around protests given the risk of coronavirus, and I stress that again today, and the importance of social distancing, the imperative on those in power is all the greater to show that they have listened, that they understand the scale of the anger and the desire for meaningful action. At moments like this, it is for our leaders to unite communities, heal divisions and confront the injustices in our society. Public Health England recently published their report on the disparities in the risk and outcomes of COVID-19, showing that black males are 4 times higher than expected to die with COVID-19. The recommendations of that report need to be made public now. Coronavirus has shone a light on inequalities that have long existed. The damning findings of the Wendy Williams Windrush Review need to be heeded and its recommendations acted upon. The Home Secretary said earlier today she was looking at them, but she needs to come to the House and tell us the action she is taking urgently. My right honourable friend, the member for Tottenham, produced a report in September 2017 on the treatment of and outcomes for black, Asian and minority ethnic people from first point of contact with the police and then throughout the criminal justice system, showing that black people make up around 3% of the general population, but accounted for 12% of adult prisoners and more than 20% of children in custody. These shameful statistics matter, and the government should implement the report's recommendations in full. In recent days, we have heard powerful testimonies from so many people on how racism continues to impact daily lives in our country. Doesn't the Home Secretary agree with me that now is not the moment for divisive rhetoric? Instead, this is a time for the government to listen, to learn and to act.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I thank the honourable gentleman for his thoughtful comments and his considered response both to my statement but also to the appalling events that we have seen, the violence in particular. And he is absolutely right in his comment about the processes around the removal of the statue and the violence that was associated with it. We live in an open society and in a democracy. We have the means and the mechanisms to bring statues down and to change the society in the way in which we wish to. But he's absolutely right, and I recognise the point that he makes about peaceful protest. It remains an absolutely important part of society and the way in which we have our voices heard, the way in which we can come together to combat the inequalities across society, but also to give service to those communities that sometimes feel that they have no voice, and find ways in which we can bring together the aspects that can help to change lives, to bring social justice together, rather than causing divisiveness in the way in which has been alluded to. But I think, Madam Deputy Speaker, it is also important to say, and the Right Honourable Gentleman refers to a number of points, some of which were aired earlier on during oral questions. When it comes to the Windrush Review, I could not have been clearer. I will return to this House, of this dispatch box, to talk about the recommendations within the context of inequality, but also within the context of many of the criticisms that were levelled at the Home Office over a substantive period of time. And it is right that we do that. But also the Right Honourable Gentleman speaks specifically about health inequalities and life chances and the lack of opportunities, particularly for the black community, violence, but also the criminal justice system as well. These are issues that we have to tackle together to understand many of the root causes, the societal causes, but importantly, provide the right solutions and the right support to the community across the country as well. And I think, Madam Deputy Speaker, if I may also just echo the words that the Honourable Gentleman has made around our police officers in particular. Those injured officers that sustained the most appalling injuries, having spoken to the Metropolitan Police Commissioner this morning, I've heard from her that the officers are recovering. They have sustained some awful, horrendous injuries, including a punctured lung and a broken collarbone, with the particular officer where the bike was thrown at the horse. That is thoroughly unacceptable, and I wish all the officers a swift and good recovery. Madam Deputy Speaker, that is exactly the type of behaviour we never want to see again on our streets. And our police continue, when it comes to coronavirus, to operate by consent, by ensuring that they have community engagement. That is at the heart of policing by consent in the United Kingdom. They have the support of the communities within which they operate. They work with the organisers. But, Madam Deputy Speaker, my final point is, with the protests that we saw over the weekend, the police and the Metropolitan Police Commissioner was absolutely clear about this. There were no community organisers to engage with. And I made the plea on Saturday as well, and I urged all the community organisers behind the protest to engage with the police so that people could protest safely, to prevent the spread of the virus, but also to prevent violence and disorder from taking place. Sadly, that did not happen. And going forward, we must work together collectively to prevent acts of violence and thuggery in the way in which you saw at the weekend, and ensure that people that do want to have their voices heard can find the right ways of doing this without necessarily coming to the streets and protesting.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Would the Home Secretary agree with me that the best way to ensure that Black Lives Matter is peaceful protest, working on ways to improve social justice and improve economic opportunities for Black people and other ethnic minorities, not lawless, senseless violence of a small minority, defacing war memorials, public monuments, because that can undermine the whole message and indeed the Black Lives Matter movement as a whole?
My honourable friend is absolutely right, and there is no doubt when it comes to inequalities and the injustice that has been shown and felt throughout the Black community in particular, that first of all, racism, discrimination in any form and shape have no place in our country and society at all. That's why, Madam Deputy Speaker, it's important that we work collectively to address the issues, address the issues of injustice, social justice, to secure social justice for the particular communities in question, to combat inequalities across all society, but importantly, increase life chances, opportunity and hope, and that is something that we should all be united on.
Joanna Cherry. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and may I thank the Home Secretary for advance sight of her statement. In the first place, I want to extend my best wishes for a full recovery to all the police officers who suffered injury during the trouble in London and to pay tribute to their brave service. I also want to unreservedly condemn the violence and disorder that took place. However, it's very important that we don't let a minority distract us from the legitimate concerns of the Black Lives Matter movement. The desire to take to the streets to protest is understandable, and across this House, one thing we share, I hope, is a cherishing of freedom of speech, freedom of expression and freedom of assembly, and the right to protest peacefully is a fundamental part of these rights. However, we are in the midst of a public health crisis, and having regard to that, the Justice Secretary in Scotland, Humza Yousaf, joined with prominent anti-racism activists to urge people in Scotland to plan protests against racial injustice in a way that safeguarded them and the wider public from the ongoing threat from COVID-19. Protests went ahead in Glasgow and Edinburgh, but they were peaceful, I'm pleased to say, and I know that the organisers and participants tried very hard to maintain social distancing. Does the Home Secretary agree with me that it's really important that we don't let the minority who engaged in violent disorder detract from the legitimacy of the concerns of the protesters and the Black Lives Matter movement? Does she also agree with me that it's very important that all in public life are careful not to do or say anything that might polarise the situation, as Trump has done in America? And finally, will she use this opportunity to make a clear commitment to review all government policies where there is evidence that they impact adversely on BAME communities, such as the no recourse to public fund policy, to which I referred to earlier this afternoon, evidence that shows that it clearly does discriminate against BAME communities? And will she also commit not just to bring back the Windrush report to this House, but commit to implement the recommendations of that lessons learned report? Thank you.
I thank the Honourable Lady for her remarks, for her support for police officers, but also respecting the right to protest in a safe and sensible and proportionate way as we are in this public health emergency. I think, Madam Deputy Speaker, it is important to labour the point that these protests are about injustice. And it is right that we come together to find the right way collectively to tackle the injustices, to fight for social justice and deliver social justice for Black, Asian, minority, ethnic communities. But as we've seen on our streets, by attacking our courageous police, individuals and a small minority have been acting in a wholly unjust way. The Honourable Lady mentioned the events in America, and of course it's dreadful. It is utterly heart-wrenching and sad to see the level of protests that we see there as well. And of course, as we've seen over the weekend, it is a small minority that are subverting the cause with which people are protesting about. And we continue, obviously, to fight to solve inequalities and injustices. The Honourable Lady has already spoken. She raised earlier on the policy issue of no recourse to public funds. She's also mentioned the Wendy Williams review and report. She's mentioned the health inequalities as well, particularly for Black communities and minority ethnic communities. It is right, as the government has addressed in this House previously last week, Madam Deputy Speaker, that we collectively come together, and the Equalities Minister is looking at this right now, in terms of the overall approach, in terms of combined policies, not just one policy, but the integral policy approach across government in terms of how we can serve these communities better, but also address many of the inequalities that have been brought to light over recent weeks.
Thank you. We now go virtually to Hendon. Dr. Matthew Offord.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. We all agree that there is injustice in the world, but does the Home Secretary agree with many of my constituents that viewing images of demonstrators throwing bikes at police officers, aiming fireworks at horses, and racially abusing other people is simply unacceptable? The irony is that public sector workers were recently being applauded, and now those very same people are being put at physical harm, both through violence and a pandemic. Will the Home Secretary agree to undertake every possible step, including the cooperation and agreement of the Mayor of London, to prevent any further demonstrations during this period of pandemic?
Secretary. Well, I thank my honourable friend for his question. He's made some very, very important points. First of all, in terms of the violence that we witnessed on the streets, the assaults on police officers, I've already made my views abundantly clear as to how unacceptable the violence and the assaults are. The Honourable Member will know, and all members understand, that when it comes to operational decisions, when it comes to policing, they are very much the operational independence of Chief Constables, the Commissioner in London in particular, and also the responsibility that Police and Crime Commissioners have for the totality of policing in their force area. When it comes to future protests, it is the responsibility of the Mayor of London to ensure that policing, but also protests in particular, do not manifest in the way in which they have done. He has a duty as well to communicate to Londoners, to express their own views in a right and proportionate way by sticking to the regulations that have been outlined by government already. I myself made views very clear over the weekend, as did the Secretary of State for Health, that we do not want to see these protests take place. We are in the midst of a health pandemic. By doing so, by gathering in this way, people's lives are being put at risk. That is not helping anybody. That is not going to stop the spread of the virus. That is not going to protect the NHS. So the Mayor of London has a very, very important role to play right now, and I would urge him to step up and do exactly that.
Yvette Cooper.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I join first with the front benches, all the front benches, in sending support and best wishes to all the police officers who have been injured and also by their strong sense that violence by a minority is always unacceptable and helps no one too. There is a responsibility on all of us to ensure this does not prevent us from coming together to respond to the strong demands for action against racism and injustice across the country. And in that spirit, the Home Secretary will know that the Home Affairs Select Committee is conducting our inquiry into policing 2 decades on from the Macpherson report. And next week we will be looking at reports that the COVID-19 enforcement fines may have been disproportionately applied to BME communities. Can I ask her whether she has looked at that and what she has found, and also whether she will provide for the Select Committee a list of all of the practical steps she and the Home Office are now taking to tackle injustice and racism?
I thank my right honourable friend for her questions, but also for the work that she is doing on this matter with the Home Affairs Select Committee. I will absolutely provide the Select Committee with the information she's asked for, and I look forward to working with her to outline the practical steps and measures, particularly around FPNs throughout the coronavirus crisis, but also look at enforcement issues and work with her to address many of the issues 20 years on since the Macpherson report when it comes to policing issues. And I know from all the conversations that I've had with the Met Police Commissioner over not just recent days, but over several months now, when it comes to diversifying London's police force, but all our police forces, making sure that we do everything within our power to work to address cultural issues, improve training, do more when it comes to recruitment, but also ensuring that all officers across the country and in London as well understand that they serve the communities in which they serve and they police, but they understand the communities of which they are members of too.
Order. The House is grateful to the Home Secretary for taking the trouble to answer in great detail all of the questions that have so far been asked. But now that we've had quite a few questions asked, we'll have to speed up a bit to try and get everyone. I know I make no criticism. These are very sensitive matters and they need to be dealt with in full. But perhaps now we can go rather faster. Robin Miller.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm pleased to say that in North Wales the protests passed off peacefully over the weekend. Does the Home Secretary agree that we have a tradition of effective, peaceful protest in this country? And can she reassure us that those who perpetrated acts of violence and criminal damage over the weekend will be brought to justice?
I thank my honourable friend for his question. He is absolutely right, and I give my thanks to his local police force and to the officers that policed the protests at the weekend. He's absolutely right. We want to ensure that swift justice occurs, which sends a very clear message out to the individuals, the perpetrators of serious violence, and we do not want to see a repeat of that again.
Florence Asylum.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Vandalism and violence should never be accepted, and I also want to pay tribute to the hard-working officers who've been on the front line, including officers from my borough of Lambeth, who are often the first to be called when there's any protest because of our location to central London. But does the Home Secretary actually understand the anger and frustration felt by so many people? Does the Home Secretary recognise that this protest has been led by young people? Does the Home Secretary recognise that there's structural inequality, discrimination and racism in our country? Does the Home Secretary recognise that people want to see action from this government? My son turned 3 yesterday. I do not want to have to wait until he's a teenager before we see changes in this country. Will the Home Secretary and this government act now? Black Lives Matter, and we need to see this government doing something about that.
Yeah. I'd say to the Honourable Lady, I'd make a number of points actually. I've been very clear in my remarks about the level of injustice that is felt across the country, and that's been illustrated in what we've seen over the weekend and the very peaceful protests that have taken place. But I'm really saddened that the Honourable Lady has effectively said that this government doesn't understand racial inequality. Well, on that basis, Madam Deputy Speaker, it must have been a very different Home Secretary who, as a child, was frequently called a packie in the playground. a very different Home Secretary who was racially abused in the streets, or even advised to drop her surname and use her husband's in order to advance her career. A different Home Secretary recently characterised, if Madam Deputy Speaker I can say so, in the Guardian newspaper as a fat cow with a ring through its nose, something that was not only racist but offensive, both culturally and religiously. This is hardly an example of respect, equality, tolerance or fairness. So when it comes to racism, sexism, tolerance or social justice, I will not take lectures from the other side of the House. I have already said repeatedly, there is no place for racism in our country or in society. And sadly, too many people are too willing, too casually, to dismiss the contributions of those who don't necessarily conform to preconceived views or ideas about how ethnic minorities should behave or think. This, Madam Deputy Speaker, in my view, is racist in itself. And as I said earlier on, both in my statement and in my answers to other colleagues in the House, to combat the real inequalities in society and to end the gross disservice to many communities, Madam Deputy Speaker, across our nation who are subject to real and pressing inequalities, we must address these issues. These are sensitive issues in an accurate and a responsible way by addressing prejudice rather than inciting and inflaming tensions.
Kevin Holland-Reid.
Well, thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I was going to say how very good it is to hear this House so united, but I think in the main it is in its support for peaceful protest, particularly one that's tackling prejudice and unfairness, but also its support for the police. Would my right honourable friend agree that the best way to support the police now is to deter future violent crime by making sure everybody who is guilty of things like throwing missiles at police, on those videos that we've all seen, that video footage is studied, those people are arrested, charged and prosecuted?
My honourable friend is absolutely right. And there should be no doubt, absolutely no doubt whatsoever, that swift justice will follow, and that is exactly what the British public want to see. They want to see the rule of law applied, but also for people to express their views in a peaceful way that is in line with the democratic values of our country.
Clive Efford.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I just I want to add my voice to those who've condemned the minority of people at the weekend who were acting in a violent way towards the police, and I wish them, those injured officers, a speedy recovery. But, Secretary of State, doesn't it just fuel the suspicion of people from the BAME community when the recommendations of something like the Public Health England report are withheld? Aren't they bound to suspect that that's the establishment feeling that they're likely to be embarrassed and made to feel awkward by those recommendations, and shouldn't they be published?
Well, I'd say to the honourable gentleman, first of all, he's speaking to a Home Secretary who's from the BME community, so there is no withholding of the data or information that he is referring to. The government has been fully committed, and the Equalities Minister is working to not just look at the data, but importantly work across government, and I think this House needs to fully recognise this, to work across government through all government departments from a policy perspective to understand the causes, whether they're health issues, housing issues, understand the range of issues that basically dominate many inequalities. And it's important that the government has the time and space to do that and actually delivers the right solutions to provide the right levels of social justice.
And we now go to Midlothian, to Owen Thompson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. In Midlothian and in Edinburgh, there are streets, a statue and other local references to Henry Dundas, but there's no mention in any of these locations of his shameful role in delaying the abolition of slavery, which forced around 630,000 slaves to wait for more than a decade for their freedom. Does the Home Secretary agree with leading human rights activist Professor Sir Geoff Palmer that we cannot erase parts of history, but that more honest narrative is needed about memorialised figures in the slave trade as a crucial step in our journey to becoming a fair and inclusive society?
In response to the honourable gentleman's question, The approach for becoming and being a fair and inclusive society also applies to the democratic ways in which we can express our views around cultural monuments, around statues, around street names. And it is right that whether it's a statue or any type of memorial, that people work through the right processes, the democratic processes with local authorities and with the right individuals to achieve the change that people want to see.
Martin Vickers.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Fortunately, my Cleethorpes constituency has had a low infection rate from COVID, but in recent weeks people have been anxious about an influx of visitors to the resort. You can imagine, Home Secretary, that they're doubly anxious this coming week because they...
I'm trying not to interrupt people because we don't have very much time, but we must make sure that we adhere to the standards of this place. The Honourable Gentleman knows, as indeed the previous Honourable Gentleman got wrong, you cannot address the Home Secretary as Home Secretary. You must address the Chair. There are still new members here who don't quite know how to do this. There are good reasons for it that we don't have to go into now. There are good reasons for it. The Honourable Gentleman must address the Chair.
My apologies, Madam Deputy Speaker. My right honourable friend will be aware that my residents are doubly anxious at the moment because a Black Lives Matters protest meeting is planned for this coming Saturday. Could my right honourable friend assure me that they can be reassured that not only will their property and people be defended, but social distancing will be enforced to maintain the low infection rate?
My friend makes a very, very important point, which is why, Madam Deputy Speaker, if I may reiterate the point that I made earlier on, we ask protest organisers to engage with the police. That way, anybody that wishes to express their views or opinion in the right way, in a socially distanced way as well, can do so and in a legitimate way. What we don't want to see are the type of things we saw over the weekend with mass protests, crowds coming together, with more or 6 people, obviously not socially distancing. We are in the midst of a health pandemic, and it's right that we undertake, all of us, responsibly, and communicate that message across all our communities, that social distancing matters, it can and will save lives, and importantly, that we continue to control this virus at this very, very delicate time.
Faye Jones.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. My honourable friend, the member for East Surrey, quoted Martin Luther King on social media this morning when she said, in spite of temporary victories, violence never brings permanent peace. Yeah. Does my right honourable friend agree with me that the violence seen over the weekend undermines the essential message of Black Lives Matter, which must be heard?
Great question. And, you know, I've made this point repeatedly, how the violence dominated what was the majority of peaceful protests and subverted the very clear message where people were making their voices heard to articulate the injustices that they see. And, of course, there is no scope for violence, and that should not be tolerated.
David Jones.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Does my right honourable friend agree that nobody reasonable could ever conclude that acts of thuggery by police officers on the streets of Minneapolis could ever justify acts of thuggery against police officers on the streets of London? And will she do everything in her power to ensure that there is no repetition of the events of last weekend?
My friend is absolutely right, and I've spoken about the violence, the disorder and the criminality that was witnessed on the streets of London this weekend. I will absolutely continue to work with chief constables and police and crime commissioners across the country, as will my honourable friend, the policing minister, to make that point again and again. While we support the right to protest, we are in a health emergency, it is right that we protect the public, but it's also right that our police forces uphold the rule of law.
John Cryer.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The violence that we saw at the weekend was simply wrong. That's straightforward. However, would the Home Secretary agree that we should look at what President Trump's doing in America and do the exact opposite? And instead of encouraging bitterness and anger and even violence, which is what he's doing on a daily basis, we should be showing leadership, bringing people together and opposing racism everywhere.
These protests are about injustice. And what we've seen in America is is dreadful, absolutely awful to see America tear itself apart. But as I have said repeatedly now, we can come together to address issues across all BAME communities, to address inequalities and the issues of young people and their life chances and the fact that they want more hope and opportunity. And that is the type of leadership the United Kingdom can show.
Jonathan Gullis.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. Residents in Stoke-on-Trent, Kidsgrove and Torque were rightly outraged when they saw the cenotaph graffitied and our Union Jack attempted to be burnt, desecrating the memories of those who paid the ultimate sacrifice for our freedoms today. Will my right honourable friend back me in supporting Lewis Fielder and the Conservative Friends of the Armed Forces by introducing a desecration of war memorials bill to enable our police and courts to more easily prosecute those who damage our sacred memorials?
I completely support the sentiment and the point that my honourable friend has just made.
Christine Jardine.
Deputy Speaker, none of us in this place or anywhere in the country, I believe, wants to see violence and vandalism on the street. None of us wanted to see a large gathering of people at a time when social distancing is so vital for public health. But more than that, none of us wanted to see the mindless violence against our police officers. But, Madam Deputy Speaker, would the Home Secretary not agree with me that the answer to that is not to ramp up the rhetoric and to throw more police officers into the fray? It's to look at the systemic injustice that there is in this country, to invest in social programmes, to invest in tackling that. I would not suggest for a minute that the Home Secretary does not understand racism, but I would ask her to rethink the government's strategy in dealing with the injustice that we have in society today.
Madam Deputy Speaker, first of all, when it comes to policing, our police continue to operate by consent, and they command the respect and cooperation of the British people by acting with integrity and accountability. And if I may say so, they do that in an outstanding way. When it comes to addressing social injustice and inequalities, as I have said repeatedly this afternoon, it is right that we come together as a government, and in fact, as a House, all honourable and right honourable members have a duty as well to their own communities to be part of the solution in addressing the injustices, and that is something that we can all collectively work to achieve.
Now, I must implore honourable members, a lot of people have bothered to come here this afternoon and they're not all going to get to ask a question because most honourable members have not asked questions. They've made statements and told stories. From now on, we'll have to have short questions, and that's one question each, and then the Home Secretary will be able to give short answers to one question. Robert Courts.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm very much trying to do that. We are lucky to live in this country under the protection of the rule of law, not least because of the actions of Winston Churchill, who defended the rule of law and defended this country against industrialised racism. Would the Home Secretary agree with me that under the rule of law, violence and vandalism has no place?
Madam Deputy Speaker, my honourable friend is absolutely right.
Liz Saville-Roberts.
Black Lives Matter protests have been held across Wales, and I too stand against the injustice and violence faced by black people here and elsewhere. Now, the vast majority of protesters respected social distancing, or they made innovative use of communications technology. Will the Home Secretary give due credit to the peaceful majority? For example, school student Sophia Matchnick-Thomas...
Order. We don't need examples. The question has been asked. Order! The question has been asked, Home Secretary.
The Honourable Lady is right that we should absolutely reflect upon the majority that have protested peacefully, and the young people. I would commend the young people in particular, whether it's through online protests, which, quite frankly, Madam Deputy Speaker, are much safer when it comes to the health endemic that we are enduring right now. But importantly, the voices of those that have protested peacefully has effectively been subverted through the violence that we saw this weekend.
Tom Hunt.
Deputy Speaker, I will just very quickly say how appalled I was at the damage to the Winston Churchill monument on the 76th anniversary of D-Day. Absolutely appalled, and my constituents. They are ignorant fools who did that, and they should be properly held to account. I would say we have a big job to get the balance right between respectful, peaceful process, but also preventing criminal damage and preventing mass destruction. Does my right honourable friend think we've got the balance right at the moment, and do the police have the powers they need to get that balance right? Thank you very much.
Deputy Speaker, the important point to make and to note is that for those that participated in violence and thuggery, justice will follow, and the police have all the powers and all the tools necessary to ensure that happens.
We now go to Rotherglen for Margaret Ferrier.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I share the Home Secretary's condemnation of anyone who engages in acts of violence, yet there remain valid concerns about the exporting of riot gear, tear gas and rubber bullets to the US, where some police forces have engaged in brutal crackdowns against peaceful protesters. Will she join calls to her colleagues in the Department for International Trade to immediately suspend export licences for this equipment to the US?
The Honourable Lady will know that the government as a whole considers all export applications thoroughly against a strict risk assessment, and all exports to the United States are conducted in line with strict guidance, and the United Kingdom operates one of the most robust licensing regimes in the world.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I thank my right honourable friend for reassuring the country that the individuals who desecrated the cenotaph, Winston Churchill's statue and the statue of Abraham Lincoln will be held to account? And does she agree that vandalising monuments to the heroes who defeated fascism, defended our freedoms and ended slavery in the United States does absolutely nothing to further the cause of equality?
My honourable friend is absolutely right, and those acts of violence were wholly counterproductive, utterly counterproductive, and that is why it's important that justice follows and the police pursue those individuals that are responsible for those crimes.
We now go to Glasgow, Carol Monaghan.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. It's important to recognise the majority of the weekend's protests, including those in Glasgow and Edinburgh, were peaceful. But to show that black lives really matter, we must examine the deeds of the past. So will the Home Secretary now commit to removing statues of slave traders from public places of honour?
Well, the Honourable Lady is right to point to peaceful protests. That is part of the vital part of a democratic society. But she's asked about the removal of statues of particular individuals. There are processes, and the Honourable Lady will know this, democratic processes that should be followed and should be respected by everybody to bring about that change, including working with councils of all colours across the country, Labour councils, Conservative councils, Lib Dem councils, and that due process is followed. And that is absolutely the right approach to take, including following the rule of law.
Richard Holden.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Throughout the pandemic, our police officers have put themselves in danger to uphold the rule of law, save lives and serve our communities. Does my right honourable friend join me in condemning the actions of violent agitators over the weekend who've not only put our brave police officers at risk, but whose actions have taken away from the reasonable, careful and important voice of lawful demonstrators?
Just before the Home Secretary answers that question, could everyone who has still got to speak please just take their pen through their introductory remarks and ask a question? Please, it's not really very difficult. Just cut out the first bit. Home Secretary.
Madam Deputy Speaker, my honourable friend is absolutely right.
Nadia Whittam.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. We'll try again. Will the Home Secretary agree with me that the government should remove statues of British figures involved in the slave trade? Further, will she agree with me that the lives of black people who have died following contact with police, like Sarah Reid and Rashant Charles, are worth more than any statue?
Madam Deputy Speaker, the Honourable Lady will be well aware, and perhaps she would like to lobby local authorities across the country to bring about the changes to statues. And I noticed the Honourable Lady celebrated the violent and criminal scenes that we saw across the weekend. I thought the politics of protest and placards had left the Labour Party with the departure of the Right Honourable Member for Islington North.
Griffith.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I'm proud that it was a Conservative government that introduced Finn's Law to protect our service animals. Will my right honourable friend assure me she will not rest until the minority of thugs involved in attacking the police horse, as well as, of course, of our brave officers, are brought to justice?
My friend is absolutely right, and what we witnessed at the weekend was utterly despicable. I look forward to visiting the mounted police horse section quite soon. And Madam Deputy Speaker, I've had it with authority from the Metropolitan Police Commissioner that the injuries, obviously, to the horse were mild, but importantly, she highlighted yet again how the acts of thuggery are disproportionate, not just to police officers, but to the animals as well.
Sarah Sultan.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Edward Colston made his fortune violently transporting 84,000 Africans to the Caribbean. At least 19,000 died en route. Statues of racist murderers like Colston can be found in cities across Britain. So I asked the Home Secretary a simple question. Does she believe it is right that black Britons have to walk in the shadows of statues glorifying people who enslaved and murdered their ancestors? Yes or no?
The Honourable Lady will join me in lobbying Labour councils across the country, where they've been in charge for many, many years to bring about the change that black, Asian, ethnic minority people would like to see.
Laura Trotz.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Does my right honourable friend agree that we must not let the violence of a minority this weekend overshadow the majority who were peacefully protesting, and that we must bring forward practical steps to address the remaining racial inequality in our society?
My friend is absolutely right, which is why the government is working with the Equalities Minister across government to address many of these issues around social injustice that need to be tackled.
We now go to Dunfermline, to Douglas Chapman.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Many Elizabethan British heroes used violence to enhance their wealth. Would the Home Secretary agree with me that violence is never part of the solution, but if we can educate our citizens in where we've been, what we've done, and to whom, that provides the basis for an equal and humane society?
My friend makes a valid point. Violent activity can never be regarded as a legitimate form of protest. And I expect those who engage in violent activity not just to face the full force of the law, but importantly, make sure that those that have a legitimate voice, that their voice is heard through the right means.
Shelbrook.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. In regard to public order, can I ask my right honourable friend to continue the policies of stop and search and get knives off the street, which not just Black Lives Matter, but all lives matter?
My honourable friend is absolutely right. Madam Deputy Speaker, one of the most extraordinary...
Order! Home Secretary.
Madam Deputy Speaker, one of the important facts about stop and search, which I've experienced myself when it comes to meeting the parents of young black men who have been murdered on the streets of London, is the significance of stop and search when it comes to taking weaponry off our streets. And I think it is important for all members of this House to recognise, and when I've seen those parents and when I've sat with them and heard of their stories, they themselves call for more stop and search to stop more young black lives being killed and to prevent more criminal and violent activities on the streets of our cities.
Chiomwara.
Thank you. Says that there is no place for racism or discrimination in our society. But there is. It is everywhere. It is crushing the hopes and lives of millions in this country. I condemn the violence and the vandalism, but the vast majority of the protests were peaceful, and I want to hear from the Home Secretary what she's actually going to do to eradicate the racism she condemns so that we do not need to have more protests in 5, 10 and 15 years.
The important point to make, Madam Deputy Speaker, this is not down to one individual. We all have a responsibility. Yes, and we all have a responsibility across government, across this House, across society to understand the inequalities and the extent of injustices. And from a government perspective, that means coming together, finding the right policy solutions, which of course this government is committed to doing.
Deanna Davison.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Will my right honourable friend join me in thanking County Durham residents for maintaining both peace and social distancing at the protests in Durham this weekend? Yeah. And will she also join me in calling for all of those who acted lawlessly and violently against our police
to face the full weight of the law as quickly as possible.
That's absolutely right, and I'd like to congratulate her constabulary for the work that they have done, and the Chief Constable, who I have spoken to recently. But importantly, those acts of violence are not acceptable, and it's right that people are absolutely, they face the full force of the law.
We now go to Aberdeen. Kirsty Blackman.
Madam Deputy Speaker, no recourse to public funds is a policy that is in place in the Home Office and disproportionately affects my black constituents. So is the refusal rate of visitor visas. Will the Home Secretary commit to looking at these structurally racist policies within the Home Office and to reforming them so they do not disproportionately affect my black constituents?
Madam Deputy Speaker, I refer the Honourable Lady to my comments on this issue earlier on.
Lucy Allen.
Deputy Speaker, my right honourable friend has offered her full support to our police in tackling violence, vandalism and disorderly behaviour. Will she encourage the Mayor of London to follow her lead?
My friend is absolutely right, and it is the responsibility of the elected Mayor of London, the Police and Crime Commissioner for London, to do exactly that.
We're a Hob House.
Thank you. Many people in Bath, Bristol and the surrounding areas have said the statue of Edward Colston should have been removed many years ago. Does she agree?
So the question is, why wasn't it, and why did the Labour Mayor not do that sooner?
James Sunderland.
Madam Deputy Speaker, will the Home Secretary join with me in paying tribute to the fortitude, professionalism and patience of our police forces in the face of yet more unnecessary aggression and violence?
Our police officers and our police forces have shown great courage over and throughout the weekend and during these protests, and I absolutely stand with them and support them as they have faced a criminal minority with the dreadful approach that they have taken and shown.
Tracy Braben.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. My inbox, like many's, is full of emails from constituents demanding we decry racism and police brutality, and I absolutely applaud that. One such constituent, Zora, second-generation British Indian, chartered accountant and mum of 3 children, asks me, according to Inquest, the proportion of BAME deaths in custody where restraint is a feature is twice as many as other deaths in custody. To build trust with communities, what can the Secretary of State tell us government is doing to end this injustice?
Madam Deputy Speaker, I think it's important to understand the facts and figures around deaths in police custody. In 2018-19, there were 16 deaths in custody, of whom 15 individuals were from a white background and 1 was black. It is important that obviously the IOPC looks at all investigations in the right way and holds to account police forces when deaths in police custodies take place, and that is exactly what happens.
Jerome Mayhew.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. It is the dehumanising of the other that makes it okay violently to attack a stranger, whether that stranger be black or white. Does my right honourable friend agree that we should listen to the peaceful voices of the BAME communities, but we should also celebrate our civilian, unarmed police who look after us all and celebrate our common humanity?
My honourable friend is absolutely right in celebrating our common humanity, but also the diversity of our great country and the people that have taken to the streets and expressed their views in a balanced and proportionate and peaceful way. And when it comes to our police, I absolutely stand with them. They've shown great courage and determination over the weekend.
Patrick Grady.
Deputy Speaker, we'll overlook the irony of the Home Secretary saying mass gatherings are unlawful while hundreds of us are required to gather here in Westminster. I wonder if she believes that the hostile immigration environment, indefinite detention, no recourse to public funds and destitution and no family reunion for unaccompanied minors sends a message that Black Lives Matter to this government.
I've been very clear about the protests over the weekend, and also how this government and how all of us as members of Parliament should look to work together to address issues of social injustice.
Laura Farris.
Deputy Speaker, my right honourable friend has quite properly said that residents should lobby local authorities to raise principled objections to offensive statues, but Bristolians have lamented the inconsistent response of the local authority. Would my right honourable friend consider publishing guidance not to determine outcomes,
but to create uniform principles so that law-abiding citizens objecting to statues can feel sure that their complaints are heard.
My friend makes a valid and important point, but if people want to see change when it comes to their local authorities and also to their police and crime commissioners, they can do that through the democratic way, which is through the ballot box.
Hold on, come and talk to me. That's all right. Lillian Greenwood.
Will she congratulate both Nottinghamshire Police and the Nottingham protest organisers on their efforts to ensure that yesterday's event was peaceful and safe, and particularly the young protesters who stopped and set about cleaning up graffiti they witnessed on Nottingham's Council House? And will she tell us whether the government has raised its concerns through official channels about the shocking and divisive reaction from the President and United States authorities to peaceful protest there?
Peaceful protest remains a vital part of our democratic society, as the Honourable Lady has said, and it is terrible what we witnessed over the weekend. But again, we speak about community spirit, the communities coming together when it comes to understanding the strength of feeling and protesting or expressing their views in the right kind of way. I've already spoken about the United States of America, and it is a tragedy in terms of what we're seeing over there.
Alexander Starford.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Will my right honourable friend agree with me that we should push the harshest of possible sentences for the perpetrators of the violence, not only for the violence caused, but also undermining the key message of equality and also for helping spread the coronavirus?
I think, Madam Deputy Speaker, it is important that as we saw post the 2011 riots, that we see swift justice. We have a process of swift justice in place to make sure justice is served for the appalling acts that we've seen over the weekend.
Bob Stewart.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Watching on the television, it seemed to me the police were holding back. They'll be holding back for good operational reasons, like they didn't want too many people hurt. But could I ask my right honourable friend to assure me that the police have every power they need to cope with future riots like they had to go through last Saturday?
My friend is absolutely right. He will know of the operational independence of our police forces, and obviously PCCs have the responsibility for the totality of policing within their force areas. When it comes to resource and support of our police officers, I'm unequivocal. We've given the police the highest funding uplift in over a decade. We are equipping them and training them so that they are equipped at the highest levels and standards, and that, of course, will continue.
We now go to Glasgow to Alison Thewlis.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The use of rubber bullets in the UK is thankfully rare, but not so in the US, and it's been identified that they have a 15% rate of permanent disability and a 3% fatality rate. Can she assure me that they will not be used here? And if they won't be used here, will she end their export to the US?
I've just been reliably told by the Policing Minister that they're not authorised for use in the mainland.
Kerry McCarthy.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. As a Bristol MP, I want to commend the way the police handled things yesterday. It was a very difficult situation for them. Does the Home Secretary agree we need to look at the underlying reasons for people going out on the streets to protest yesterday and accept that austerity and COVID-19 and many other issues are factors behind that?
I think there are a number of issues here in terms of the question from the Honourable Lady. First of all, I have spoken to the Chief Constable for Avon and Somerset. So I've had, and the Policing Minister and I have had a considerable debrief in terms of what happened yesterday. In terms of protest, I've already spoken about the right to protest in a peaceful, lawful and respectful manner. What we witnessed yesterday was mob rule, which is completely out of kilter with the rule of law and unacceptable.
Gary Sandbrook.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The protests in Birmingham last week were very peaceful, but unfortunately the same can't be said for the weekend's protests in London. And so does she agree with me that there is never any excuse for thuggish and violent behaviour against our police officers?
My friend is absolutely right.
Lloyd Russell Moyle.
Look, I congratulate many of the peaceful protesters and the police and authorities that have helped facilitate those protests, acknowledging that the UK still is a racist country for many people. But the Home Secretary is eager to comment on operational matters, but stays quiet when, of course, Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister, encouraged lots of sunbathers, predominantly white, to mass gather on the beaches of Brighton. Is it only white sunbathers that are the problem? Or is it only black protesters that are the problem and not white sunbathers? Will the Home Secretary ensure that messages are coherent on this issue? And will she speak out
Secretary.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The government's position on coronavirus could not be any clearer. It is coherent. The honourable gentleman should understand that the message in terms of saving lives, staying alert and
Secretary.
And not participating in mass gatherings of 6 more people is dangerous to public health. That message, I have made that point today. In fact, the Health Secretary was in the chamber prior to this statement, echoing very much those points as well. I say to the honourable gentleman, we are in a public health emergency. It's down to all of us, whether as local MPs, councillors or citizens in our community, to make sure that we all uphold those standards, as the majority of the public have done, so that we can save lives and protect the NHS.
Brian.
Everyone has the right to peaceful, lawful protest, but in a pandemic they do not, whatever the cause, have the right to act in a way which could impact on others who choose to not hit the streets in a mass gathering. So does the Home Secretary take the view that, as well as ministers pleading with the public to stay away on health grounds, police forces should warn those organising such events that they are organising what are currently illegal gatherings?
Absolutely right. This comes back to the point that I made earlier on. Many of the organisers behind these protests are not engaging with the police. Police forces around the country have worked incredibly hard over the last 10 and 11 weeks to get that message out there by engaging within their communities, and that is something that they will continue to do.
Natalie Elphick.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Given the risk that these protests may cause a second wave of this virus and the disgraceful violence and destruction that we have seen, does the Home Secretary agree that it's time to give the police greater powers to control demonstrations and marches, where police commanders believe there is serious risk to public health, public order and to property?
This weekend has shown, Madam Deputy Speaker, that these protests are a threat to public health. And on those grounds alone, our police officers are working night and day across the country to reiterate that point and communicate that message. My final comment is that the operational independence of chief constables is recognised in law, and of course the 2011 Act gives police and crime commissioners responsibility for policing within their forces, and it's important that they reiterate many of these important and essential messages.
Thank you, and I thank the honourable members who took part in the second half of that statement for being swift, and therefore we were able, within just over an hour, to allow everybody who wanted to participate to do so, and that's a fair and decent way of doing things. Thank you very much. In order to allow the safe exit of honourable members participating in this item of business and the safe arrival of those participating in the next, I'm now suspending the House for 5 minutes. Order.